Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. You're going to time travel into the cold, like real cold. The kind of cold that doesn't care about your wool socks or how tough you think you are. Tonight, we're exploring how people, real, breathing, shivering humans, survived brutal whiteout blizzards in medieval times. No weather app, no down jackets, no indoor heating, just their wits, whatever materials they could scrape together, and a whole lot of stubbornness. Spoiler. You probably wouldn't survive this. Most people didn't. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, what time is it where you are, and what city are you watching from? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts quietly. The wind picks up, not suddenly but slowly like a deep inhale. Birds vanish first. If you're a medieval farmer in some tucked-away English valley or a shepherd on the slopes of the Carpathians, you know what's coming. You've seen this before. The sky turns that strange soft iron colour. Clouds roll heavy over the hills, and the silence becomes thick, padded by the first dry flakes that melt on your cheek, only to be replaced by a wall of white. This isn't just snow. This is the start of a blizzard, a deadly one. And if you haven't prepared your shelter, you're already in trouble. In medieval times, people didn't wait for winter to start thinking about survival. They began prepping in late summer. Crops were harvested and stored, wood was chopped and stacked meticulously, and homes, however humble, were checked for weaknesses. And even though winter came every year like clockwork, it never got easier. You're always one storm away from catastrophe. One of the first things you'd learn? The land doesn't care. Doesn't matter if you're a freeman or a serf. If the snow comes fast and hard and you're not ready, it'll take you. And because medieval weather was unpredictable, there wasn't a calendar you could fully trust. Locals relied on natural signs instead. That strange silence in the woods, how low the birds flew, the way your animals acted, skittish, huddling, refusing to leave the barn. Some villagers passed down weather rhymes that weren't just folklore, they were survival tools. If the moon's halo is wide, snow will ride, and if the cows lay down all day, you'd better double-check your thatch. Because what comes next might not just be cold, it might be days of disorienting, howling whiteness. If you lived in a stone cottage, lucky you, you had at least one strong wall to protect you. More often, though, people lived in wattle and daub homes. Think of thin wooden stakes interwoven with twigs and slathered in mud. Insulation. Barely. Drafts. Constant. And the moment a serious storm rolled in, you'd feel every ounce of nature's bite creeping through the walls. So what do? You seal everything. Gaps are stuffed with moss or straw. Extra hides or old cloaks get nailed across door frames. Animal dung, dried and pressed, becomes a makeshift patch for wind-battered corners. And windows? Nope. Most people didn't have glass. Only the wealthy did. You had shutters made of wood or cloth, and once those were closed, your whole world became dark, smoky and close. Time becomes strange inside a medieval shelter during a storm. The wind howls outside and snow piles higher and higher against the door. You measure the storm not in hours, but in the depth of snow stacked against your walls. Kids are tucked into shared straw beds covered with every textile the household owns. If there's a baby, they sleep near the fire, wrapped in wool, sometimes with a warm rock tucked into the swaddling. The fire becomes everything. It's your heat, your light, your cooking and your sanity. You feed it constantly. No firewood, no warmth. If the blizzard keeps you stuck indoors for days, you start rationing. Not just food, but flame. Some families burned dried dung or old bones, even furniture legs if it came to it. There's a saying in some parts, you can rebuild a chair, but not a child. You might think the worst part of a blizzard is the cold, but no, it's the isolation. It's the fear that no one will come if your roof caves in, that if the wind seals your door shut, you'll starve in the dark with the cows groaning beside you. Fun fringe fact. Some communities actually use blizzards to their advantage. A thick snowpack could insulate the home from worse cold if it didn't collapse the roof first. Snow drifted up against outer walls would sometimes be packed tight to help stop drafts. Nature's inconvenient but occasionally helpful insulator. Of course, we don't fully agree on how every peasant handled these storms. Some historians argue that shelter quality varied wildly, even within the same village. Others believe that oral traditions about weather wisdom were just embellished over time. We may never know the exact rituals people followed, but one thing is clear. People were always afraid of the sky. Imagine you're lying on a bed of straw, your breath visible even indoors, your fingers are numb, and the baby has a cough that won't quit. Outside, it's nothing but wind, white, and the creak of the roof beams. Your only hope is that your prep work was good enough, that the food lasts, that the snow doesn't get in, and still you wait. Not for rescue, for the sun, for the first tiny crack of light through the shutters that tells you it's over, or at least this storm is. By now you've figured out that snow in the Middle Ages wasn't charming. It wasn't something you played in. It was the weather's way of flipping the table and seeing who was still standing after. Because once the blizzard really sets in, once that first day of heavy flakes turns into 3, maybe 5, maybe a week, you're no longer just trying to stay warm. You're trying to stay sane. Snow in medieval Europe didn't just fall, it buried, it erased. The kind of snowfall that collapsed roofs and silenced villages wasn't fluffy postcard snow. It was wet, heavy, and relentless. Some chroniclers describe entire homesteads being eaten by white, their chimneys the only visible part. And that's not poetic exaggeration. In places like Scandinavia and the Alps, whole structures disappeared under snowpack. People had to dig upward just to get out of their front doors, assuming they still knew where the door was. And inside, the air is damp. Every breath feels cold going in and colder coming out. Firewood, even if you stockpiled it, burns fast. You curse yourself for not cutting more in October. You can hear the snow groaning on the roof, especially at night when it shifts, melts slightly, then refreezes. The sound is like a muffled creak from some ancient beast perched above your house, deciding whether to sit still or crush you. If you're lucky, you've got neighbours nearby, close enough that you can yell to them once the storm passes, see if they're still alive. But in many rural areas, the closest farm could be a mile or more away, and during a storm that may as well be the moon. Even venturing to the barn becomes an expedition. You tie a rope from the door of your cottage to the barn entrance, if you're smart, because even a few steps into the storm can leave you lost. Snowflakes swirl so thick they blot out the world, and it becomes terrifyingly easy to turn around once, twice, and lose all sense of direction. That's how people died. Not from the cold itself, but from confusion, from wandering, from thinking, I'll just run to check on the animals real quick, and never making it back. Some tried to anchor themselves by voice, yelling to someone inside to keep talking so they could follow the sound. But wind steals voices, buries them. There's a word some Nordic villagers used, snowgrotta, a snow cave. But in this case, it wasn't a survival shelter built by travellers. It was what happened when a house got fully snowed in. You were living inside one, whether you liked it or not. And the pressure that snow could exert on your roof, incredible. Thousands of pounds, depending on the water content. Thatched roofs were at serious risk. If the angle wasn't steep enough to let snow slide off, it stayed. Built up, pushed down. That's when you'd start hearing the beams cracking. Families would sleep in shifts, someone always awake to monitor for sounds of breaking wood just in case. Some homes had a clever trick to deal with the threat of collapse. A central support beam, intentionally oversized, called the lifelog in a few Slavic regions. It wasn't decorative. It was the difference between getting through a storm and waking up under 4 feet of timber and snow. And yet, as brutal as these conditions were, some people managed to not only survive, but adapt. They got creative. A quirky little tradition pops up in Swiss alpine communities, where people hung hollow gourds from the rafters with strings. Why? So that when snow started to pile too high on the roof, the gourds would tilt or sway from the shifting weight, giving an audible warning before collapse. Low-tech, sure, but incredibly smart. Still, no matter how many tricks you had, nothing truly softened the psychological weight of a multi-day blizzard. Cabin fever wasn't just a phrase. In tight medieval shelters, you lived cheek to jowl with your entire family and sometimes extended relatives and livestock. You'd have a pig snoring in the corner, a goat chewing something it shouldn't, a toddler wailing because they're cold, and the smell. Let's just say hygiene wasn't the top priority when your wash basin was frozen solid. You pass the time how you can, telling stories, sharpening tools, darning clothes, praying. Lots of praying. Children are often told saints will protect them from the cold, especially St. Eulalia or St. Nicholas. But protection sometimes means simply not freezing to death. It doesn't promise comfort, and it's around day 3, maybe day 4, that things start to shift. You've already eaten the softer bread and whatever dried apples or smoked meat you had set aside. The hearth is burning lower now, You're more careful with the kindling. You huddle together more tightly, not just for warmth, but for reassurance. To remind each other you're still here. The strange part is, once your body adjusts, once you accept that the cold is a constant and not an emergency, your mind goes quiet. You stop checking the windows every hour. You stop listening for the wind. You just exist in the heavy silence of snow. There's debate among scholars about how much people dreaded winter versus how much they simply accepted it. Some argue that we project modern anxieties onto the past, thinking they must have feared storms the way we do. Others say no, they feared it more, because they knew exactly how quickly it could kill. That fear wasn't theoretical. It was carved into the memory of every village. One Norse saga tells of a man who walked out during a storm to find his son, and returned with frostbitten fingers, carrying nothing but a wool cap. The boy had simply vanished. The story isn't told with tragedy, it's told with stoic resignation. As if, of course, this would happen. What else did you expect? And that's the thing. In the medieval mind, winter was not unfair, it was simply what happened. A season, yes, but also a trial. You didn't beat it, you outlasted it, and so you wait. In your dark little cottage, huddled close to the fire, listening to the wind, you check the door again, still sealed. You ration the last of the dried beans and stare at the ceiling when it creaks. Maybe, just maybe, tomorrow will bring light. The hearth. It's easy to romanticize, isn't it? A glowing fire, a few logs crackling, maybe a big black pot bubbling with stew. But in a medieval blizzard, the hearth isn't romantic. It's your last defense, your anchor, your small, flickering line between survival and a cold, quiet death. You learn very quickly that in a stone cottage or timber frame hut, the fire isn't just a comfort, it's your only shot at making it through the night. If you're lucky, your hearth is built into a central wall with a decent chimney. Though let's be honest, most chimneys in medieval Europe were a smoky joke. More often, smoke just kind of wafted upward through a hole in the roof or escaped out a gap near the ceiling. Which means that yes, your home was warmish but also hazy with wood smoke, your eyes constantly watering, and your lungs working overtime. Still, that smoke had its fringe benefits. It discouraged insects and helped preserve meat hung in the rafters. But smoke is a minor complaint when the temperature outside has dropped to the kind of cold that cracks the surface of water in your wooden pail before you can pour it. You're crouched near the fire, hands extended, rotating slowly like a roast on a spit. Maybe you burn yourself a little on a flying spark. Fine, you take it. Because the rest of the room is an icebox and there are no second chances if the fire goes out. You know to sleep near it. People pull straw pallets or rush mats close to the hearth on storm nights, even if it means waking up with one side scorched and the other frozen. Families might sleep in a pile, with the youngest or oldest nearest the warmth. You wrap yourself in wool or hide and you don't move. Every step away from the fire costs you degrees, literally. One historical account from a 14th century German village tells of a blizzard so severe that families burned their bed frames and even roofing beams to keep the hearth going. That was the level of desperation and faith. You hoped the fire would last, that the roof wouldn't collapse before it was your turn to sleep, and that the smoke wouldn't kill you before the cold did. Fuel management became a kind of dark art. In the fall, you'd stack firewood meticulously, logs cut just the right size, seasoned if possible, which means you had to think about winter a whole year in advance. Dung was a common supplement, especially for peasants who didn't have forests nearby. Dried animal waste might not sound appealing, but it burned slow and steady, with a surprisingly tolerable smell once you got used to it. Some shelters had multiple fires, a cooking hearth in the central space, and maybe a small brazier in the sleeping area. But let's not pretend everyone had that kind of setup. Most people had one fire, and that was it. No firewood. Too bad. You might start burning baskets, stools, or even sections of the door. But the hearth was more than a heating source. It was the psychological centre of the home. Everything happened around it. Meals, mending, storytelling, prayers, and during a blizzard it became a kind of shrine. People watched it obsessively, kept a pile of kindling nearby, always dry, stoked it with a practised rhythm, knowing too much poking would kill the embers and too little would let it fade. There were tricks. Coals were banked under ash at night to keep them smouldering until morning. Some communities used hot stones, heating them in the fire and then wrapping them in cloth to place under bedding. Others placed small clay pots filled with embers beneath stools or makeshift footrests. a DIY foot warmer that could make all the difference. And the fire taught you patience. You didn't just light it and forget it. It was a living thing. It had moods. Some nights it flared high, dancing up the chimney in defiance of the storm. Other nights it sulked, needing coaxing, fed gently with dry twigs or peeled bark. You learned to listen to it, to understand when it needed more fuel or more air. What's still debated among historians is how much technical fire-building knowledge was common among the peasantry. Did every child know how to start a flame from flint and steel? Was there someone in the village who specialised in fire tending, like a proto-chimney sweep or firekeeper? Some say yes, especially in communal settings like monasteries or large manors. Others argue that survival made everyone a fast learner. Quirkier sources mention witch stones, charred rocks kept near the hearth, believed to hold heat longer and keep evil spirits at bay. Whether or not you believe in the magic, it's easy to see why they'd want all the heat they could get. If it came with a side of demon protection, even better. Still, a hearth couldn't heat an entire house, not even close. The warmth faded fast once you moved away from the flames. The walls didn't hold heat, the floors were dirt or stone, and there was no such thing as insulation as we know it today. So you adapted. You shrank your world. The fire created a sphere of livable space, and that was your universe for the duration of the storm. Children learned not to play too far from the hearth. Adults worked close by, using daylight hours sparingly before the gloom of snowstorms dimmed everything into twilight. And meals were kept simple. A pot of beans or cabbage, something that could sit on the fire all day, fed in bits and pieces. The fire also served as your timekeeper. No clocks. Just the rhythm of feeding the flame, boiling the next batch of water, waiting for it to die low before stoking it again. Your body learned the pulse of survival. Wake, check the fire, eat, warm your hands, sleep in fits. By day 5 of the storm, you stop wondering what's happening outside. You've entered a different headspace. A smaller world, yes, but not a hopeless one. The fire is still there, alive, and as long as it burns, so do you. Out here you build with whatever you've got, and what you've got usually isn't much. No concrete, no screws, no Home Depot 10 minutes down the road, just mud, wood, stones pried from the earth with blistered hands. And yet people built shelters that withstood blizzards so intense they could strip the bark off trees and turn breath into ice mid-air. Not because they wanted to, they had no other choice. If your walls failed in the middle of a medieval winter, you didn't get a do-over. In most of Europe, especially rural areas, the basic building recipe was pretty simple. Timber for framing, mud and straw for walls, and thatch or wooden shingles for roofing. It's the medieval version of some assembly required, except instead of being frustrated over a confusing instruction manual, you're praying your house doesn't collapse under 6 feet of snow. You don't build to impress the neighbours, you build to not die. Let's start with the bones. Timber. If you're lucky enough to live near woodland, you might have straight-grained oak or ash. These beams become your frame, notched together with mortise and tenon joints, secured with wooden pegs. Nails are precious and used sparingly, sometimes not at all. Every beam is hand-hewn. Every board is dragged, lifted and wrestled into place with more sweat than finesse. The walls? That's where wattle and daub comes in. First you weave long, flexible sticks, often hazel or willow, between upright posts. This woven mat, the wattle, becomes the skeleton of your wall. Then comes the daub, a sticky, gloopy mix of wet clay, animal dung, chopped straw, and maybe a bit of ash or sand for texture. You slap it on with bare hands, smoothing it into every crevice. It's messy, smelly, and kind of satisfying. And when it dries, surprisingly sturdy, not exactly bulletproof, but it holds out the wind, the snow, and, if you're lucky, the occasional curious rat. Roofing is a whole other art form. Thatch is the go-to for many peasant homes. Bundles of straw or reeds layered thick and tied to a wooden frame with rope or split wood fastenings. Done well, it's weatherproof and shockingly warm. The trick is getting the angle steep enough so snow doesn't pile up too heavily. And it needs regular maintenance. You patch it before winter, clear it after every storm, and pray the mice don't move in during the off-season. If you live somewhere rockier, say Northern England or the Scottish Highlands, you might be working with dry stone. No mortar, just stones stacked tight with painstaking care. These buildings had thick, squat walls to retain heat and resist collapse. Some still stand today, hunched low against the landscape like they're bracing for another storm centuries later. And then there's turf. In Iceland and parts of Scandinavia, wood was scarce, so they built with dirt, literally. Large slabs of sod, cut from grassy plains, stacked over wooden frames to create earthen walls. The result looked like a hobbit house, but make no mistake, it was genius. The thick turf had excellent insulation properties, and snow just added an extra layer of protection. People basically turned nature into a thermal blanket. What's wild is how different these homes could be even just a few miles apart. Local conditions dictated every choice. In marshy areas, builders raised homes on slight mounds or added stone foundations to keep floors from flooding. In forested regions, they used more wood. In windy coastal villages, walls were angled or reinforced with extra layers of daub to stop the gales from peeling them apart. There was no one-size-fits-all. Shelter was an ongoing experiment conducted under the threat of death. And it wasn't just about materials, it was how you built. For example, most homes didn't have large open rooms. Instead, they were broken into tight, low-ceilinged spaces. It wasn't claustrophobia, it was strategy. Smaller rooms were easier to heat, easier to insulate. Ceilings were low to trap warmth from the hearth. Beams often hung just above your head, darkened with years of smoke and soot, each one a silent witness to countless winters. Another key feature, the door. Always small, often facing away from prevailing winds. Sometimes there was a simple vestibule or windbreak structure added, a primitive mudroom, so the storm couldn't blast straight into the living space when someone came in. Drafts were constant enemies, and you'd find every crack stuffed with something. Rags, moss, straw, sheep wool, even the odd bit of chewed leather. Nothing was wasted. Everything could be turned into weatherproofing. Now it wasn't perfect. These homes were cold, damp, smoked up and dirty. But they did the job. They kept the snow out and the heat, such as it was, in, and they could be repaired quickly. If a wall cracked, you slapped on more daub. If a thatch section leaked, you patched it with fresh straw from the barn. These were not pristine cottages from a fairy tale. They were living, breathing systems patched together with equal parts desperation and ingenuity. There's some academic debate over just how good medieval peasant housing actually was. Earlier scholars painted a pretty bleak picture. Huts barely better than tents, collapsing under their own weight. But more recent archaeology suggests these homes were more resilient than we gave them credit for. Many were in use for generations, rebuilt and expanded over time. You can even find signs of seasonal upgrades, extra layers of daub added in fall, temporary inner walls erected to make spaces smaller and warmer during winter. Here's a weird, fun tidbit. Some households used fish oil as a kind of winter caulk. In Scandinavian fishing villages, they'd smear it along window frames, or between wall joints to keep out drafts. It reeked. But it worked. Imagine your house smelling like warm cod stew for 3 months, but you're alive, so you don't complain. And through it all, there's this core idea. You don't build to thrive. You build to endure. Your home becomes a shield, a shell, a place to survive something vast and indifferent. Every beam you hoist, every stone you stack, every patch of daub you slap on, it's all part of the quiet war you're waging against the cold. Because you know what's coming. You can feel it in the air. Winter doesn't knock. It pushes. And when it does, your shelter is the only line between your family and the deep, blank silence of snow. You wake up to a sound you don't want to hear, a groan from above. Not the wind, not the shifting of snow outside, but the deep wooden complaint of your own roof. You freeze, you listen. There it is again, a creaking, splintering stretch, like the bones of the house are under pressure. And they are. Because as beautiful as falling snow might look when you're warm and watching from a window, it's also incredibly heavy. And medieval roofs. And let's just say they weren't exactly designed with blizzards in mind. Here's the reality. Snow load is deadly. A fresh snowfall might seem light, but once it starts accumulating, especially when it's dense and wet, it can weigh over 20 pounds per cubic foot. Now imagine 2, 3, even 4 feet of that pressing down on your thatch or shingles. The roof isn't just carrying snow, it's carrying a slow, freezing avalanche. And every minute it stays up is a gamble. In the Middle Ages, people understood this not through science, but through pain. They didn't have measurements. They had memories. Memories of roofs collapsing in the middle of the night, of entire families buried while they slept, of the telltale crack, then the rush of snow, timber and soot as the sky fell in. You spring into action. You grab the long-handled tool you keep near the hearth just for this purpose. Maybe it's a wooden rake. Maybe it's a pole with a flat board tied to the end. You push open the front door, barely able to get it ajar with the drift built up outside, and start knocking snow off the eaves. It tumbles down in slow-motion slabs, sometimes hitting you square in the face. But you don't stop. You can't. Because once the centre beam goes, the rest follows fast. In some areas, especially the Alps and parts of Scandinavia, houses were built with sharply angled roofs, steep enough that most snow couldn't stick. That was intentional. It made roofing harder, but collapse less likely. In flatter regions, where steep roofs were impractical or too expensive, people relied more on frequent clearing and internal support. Sometimes they built wooden snow frames into the attic, basically a series of angled crossbeams under the main roof, designed to catch weight before it hit the living space. And still, collapse happened. There's a documented account from 1322 in eastern France of a blizzard so intense that it brought down several barns and homes in a single night. Survivors reported waking up in darkness, trapped under a mixture of thatch, splintered beams, and snow so tightly packed it was like ice. They clawed out with their bare hands. Inside the home, you'd try to spot early warnings, sagging ceilings, beams that suddenly started to bow or creak more than usual, cold drafts pushing in through new cracks. In some regions, they hung weighted cords or tied ribbons to ceiling beams to track subtle shifts in alignment. If the cord changed angle, that meant the roof was bending, slowly but surely. But here's a fringe solution you wouldn't expect: burning holes into the snowpack. In parts of Russia and northern Germany, some villagers, when trapped, would take hot stones or burning bundles of straw and toss them up onto the roof to melt channels into the snow. It wasn't efficient, and it definitely wasn't safe. But if the snow was too thick to rake off, and you couldn't get on the roof without risking a fall, sometimes fire was your last tool. Now, if the roof did start to go, there were emergency moves. Some homes had full shelters, basically small alcoves reinforced with extra timber, where families could retreat if the main structure collapsed. Think of it like an early panic room, but instead of hiding from bandits, you were hiding from your own ceiling. Debate continues among scholars about just how widespread these emergency practices were. Some argue that most peasants simply didn't have the resources or foresight to build backup structures. Others point to archaeological digs that show curious doubled-up beam patterns and compact sleeping quarters, suggesting people did plan for cave-ins. Honestly, it's probably both. In some villages, people innovated. In others, they hoped. And when the worst happened? Well, the village took care of its own. After a collapse, neighbours would dig out what they could, rebuild together, and salvage anything not ruined by snowmelt. Roofs weren't built to last decades. They were maintained constantly, replaced every few years, and often rebuilt from whatever was cheapest or available: reeds, twigs, grass, pine branches. One peculiar tradition in certain Baltic regions was the roof charm, a small carved talisman nailed to the ridge beam before snowfall. Usually shaped like a bird or a spiral, it was supposed to protect the home from both spirits and storms. Did it work? Probably not. But when your roof groaned under a mountain of snow, it helped to believe something was up there watching out for you. So you finish clearing the snow, at least for now. Your cheeks are raw, fingers stiff, breath steaming like a chimney. The roof is holding. But you know it's not over. This isn't a one-time fix. As long as the storm continues, you'll have to keep checking, keep clearing, keep listening for that telltale creak that tells you winter is knocking a little too hard. Back inside, you look up at the ceiling, dark, damp, bowed in spots, and wonder how much longer it'll last. You touch the main beam gently. It's cold, but solid. For now. You sit near the hearth again, snow still melting in your boots, and try not to think about the weight pressing down from above. Because in the Middle Ages, shelter isn't a thing you build once and forget. It's a thing you live with, patch, protect, and sometimes pray over. Especially when the sky is falling. There's cold, and then there's blizzard cold. The kind that finds every crack, every knot in the wood, every lazy patch in your wall, and slips through like it owns the place. Drafts in a medieval home are not occasional breezes. They are relentless, invisible hands reaching in to steal warmth from your bones. If your shelter isn't sealed tight, it becomes a glorified icebox, and no fire is big enough to keep the cold at bay. So tonight, you learn to windproof your world, medieval style. You start with the doors. They're not exactly airtight. Most are just rough-hewn planks held together with iron nails or wooden pegs, and if they've warped, which they probably have, there's a visible gap at the bottom, maybe even one along the hinge. Easy fix? Not quite. But you get creative. You pack moss into the seams, wedge bundles of straw in the cracks, hang an old wool cloak or a woven mat across the inside to block the wind. It's not elegant, but when the night wind starts shrieking, you'll be grateful. Next up, the windows, or what passes for them. Unless you're wealthy, and let's be honest, you're probably not, you don't have glass. Maybe you've got a small opening with a wooden shutter, maybe oiled parchment or stretched animal bladder covers the hole, letting in light but keeping out some of the chill. You stuff the frame with cloth scraps, mud, or more moss. Then you close the shutter and hope for the best. On storm nights, most folks just block windows entirely. Darkness is better than frostbite. Even the walls betray you. Wattle and daub isn't bad, but it shifts over time. Cracks form, bits flake off. You walk the perimeter of your single-room home with a candle, watching for flickers, tiny quivers in the flame that tell you where the wind is getting in. It's a slow, silent ritual, one that everyone in the house understands. Find the holes, fix them fast. You slap on more daub if you have it. If not, mud, dung, rags, whatever's handy. One of the more creative solutions you've adopted, learned from your grandmother, is the winter wall. It's not actually a wall, it's a hanging. You take the heaviest textile you own, usually a coarse woolen blanket, and nail or tack it to the interior walls during the worst part of winter. It creates an insulating layer between you and the cold and gives the illusion of warmth, even if the room temperature hasn't changed a degree. In some homes, people make entire sleeping cubbies out of blankets and hide in there for hours, conserving body heat. Floor drafts are the sneakiest of all. You may not have a proper floor, just packed earth or loose boards. Cold seeps up through your feet like it's hunting you. You spread rushes, hay, or even old reeds across the ground, anything to create a buffer. In more northerly regions, peat moss is a go-to. It insulates, it's soft underfoot, and if it gets dirty, you just throw it out and spread new. Richer folks might have rugs or sheepskins, but you work with what you've got. A layer of straw over a blanket makes a surprisingly warm pad to sleep on. Not comfortable, but warm. There are even fringe methods passed around in whispers and folk songs, like stuffing dried nettles or crushed pine needles into the walls to repel moisture and keep out the sickness. Some say that nettles also keep out ghosts. That's probably not true, but when you're wrapped in 3 layers of rags, listening to the wind whistle through your roof beams, a ghost-free night sounds pretty great. Scholars today argue over whether medieval homes were ever truly sealed. Some say the idea of a cosy, windproof cottage is a fantasy, that most peasant homes were drafty, miserable and barely survivable. Others point out evidence from preserved foundations and surviving documents suggesting people did care deeply about warmth and found practical ways to manage it. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Most shelters weren't perfect, but people weren't clueless either. Take the example of the Highland crofts in medieval Scotland. These homes were built low, with thick stone walls and turf roofs, but inside, families still hung wool tapestries or skins across walls and ceilings to trap warmth. Some even built bed boxes, wooden compartments like mini-cabins within the cabin, closed off with shutters or curtains. You'd crawl inside to sleep, like curling up inside a cupboard. Not exactly luxury, but it worked. In parts of Eastern Europe, villagers took a more radical approach. They built dual-layered homes, one outer structure for animals and storage, and an inner one, a kind of shelter within a shelter for people. It's a technique still seen in some traditional mountain homes, and it's brilliant in its simplicity. The outer building takes the brunt of the cold. The inner one holds what heat it can. You also get used to layering your home the way you layer your clothes. The roof might get an extra thatch covering. Walls get daubed again. Floors are re-rushed. You build up. You build out. Every surface becomes a battleground in your silent war with the cold. And once you've done everything you can, you wait. Wrapped in whatever layers you own, back to the fire, shoulders hunched against the next gust that finds its way through. It's never perfect. The draft always finds a path. But each gap you plug buys you a little more time, a little more warmth, a little more chance to wake up in the morning without ice on your eyelashes. So you huddle closer. You watch the curtain across the door sway slightly, feel the sting of cold around your ankles where the rushes have shifted. You pull the blanket higher over your shoulder and tuck it under your chin. You've sealed everything as best you can. The storm can rage all it wants. You're still here. Thatch might look charming in a painting, golden, shaggy, maybe a little whimsical, but when the snow starts falling like flour dumped from the sky, thatch becomes your line of defence. A roof made of straw doesn't exactly scream high-tech survival, but in the medieval world it was the default. You didn't thatch your roof because it was stylish. You did it because it was cheap, repairable, and, when done right, surprisingly effective at standing up to the worst a winter could throw at you, at least for a little while. You start to understand the science of it by instinct. A good thatch roof is thick, really thick. We're talking at least a foot, sometimes up to 2. Bundles of wheat straw, water reeds, heather, or rushes are tied to the roof frame in overlapping layers, much like shingles. Only, instead of tile, it's bundles of vegetation bound with cords or held in place with wooden pegs. The layering creates a natural shedding system. Rain rolls off. Snow ideally slides. But here's the problem. Ideally. A blizzard doesn't care about your layering technique. Wet snow clings. Freezing rain turns to ice sheets. Even well-laid thatch starts to sag under the weight. And if you didn't do your prep work, patching thin spots, tightening the bundles, making sure your roof pitch is steep enough, you're going to hear it. First a thud, then a drip, then a slow, seeping chill that tells you winter just came inside. Medieval villagers developed a sixth sense for this. During a storm, someone always checked the ceiling. You'd reach up, touch the inner reed mat with the back of your hand, feel for cold spots or moisture. If your fingers came away wet, you knew exactly what kind of night it was going to be. You moved sleeping mats away from the drip, found a bucket if you had one, and hoped the breach didn't grow, or worse, collapse. Snow thatch failure could be instant or gradual. Gradual was better. Gave you time to react. Sudden collapse. That was rare, but terrifying. There's a written account from a 13th century Welsh parish where a thatch roof gave way under heavy snow during Sunday Mass. It was a church, not a home, but the concept was the same. A blizzard, a load of snow, 1 week patch, and boom! Roof, snow, and fragments of reed raining down on everyone inside. They wrote it off as divine punishment. Honestly, it was probably just poor maintenance. If you had the time and the weather let you, you could rake the snow off from below, pushing it through the gaps or using a hooked pole to shake the thatch from inside. It made a mess. Bits of straw snowed down on the fire, on the food, on your bed. But it was better than losing your entire ceiling. And yet, as basic as thatch was, it had its advantages. For one, it insulated surprisingly well. The thick, dry plant material trapped air, and once a layer of snow settled on top, ironically, it added even more insulation. That layer of white acted like a thermal blanket, keeping heat inside and noise out. In a well-maintained thatch home, it could be 30 degrees warmer inside than out, and that was no small thing when the outside was doing its best impression of a frozen wasteland. Still, you didn't rely on thatch alone. In winter, you'd reinforce the underside with woven mats, extra rafters, or even hang old blankets across the beams to catch stray drips. In some alpine villages, they created a false ceiling of cloth, a sheet hung from one end of the room to the other, about 6 feet above the floor. It trapped heat below and caught melting snow above, like a giant hammock for water damage. One quirky but real tradition was the roof singing test. In some northern European communities, before the first real snow of winter, families would go outside and sing or whistle up at their thatch. If the roof muffled the sound properly, it meant it was thick and tight enough. If they could hear an echo or too much sound pass through, it was time to add more thatch. Sound as a stand-in for insulation. Honestly pretty clever. Thatch also had to be animal-proof. Birds loved nesting in it. Mice chewed it. In winter, desperate foxes or even feral cats might try to burrow into the roof for warmth. If you heard something scrabbling up there during a storm, you had to hope it wasn't something that would dig a hole straight into your bedroom, and yet people swore by it. Not because it was perfect, but because it was accessible. A few days of harvesting, some rope, a ladder, and you could rethatch half your roof. There were even communal thatching days, neighbours helping each other reinforce their homes before winter. It wasn't just maintenance, it was a social event. Tools passed hand to hand. Kids ran around collecting loose straw. The elderly gave pointed advice from the doorway. No one wanted to see a neighbour's roof give out in the middle of February. Modern historians sometimes argue over how standardised thatching techniques really were. Some suggest it was regional. What worked in England wouldn't necessarily work in Flanders or the Baltics. Others believe there was more sharing of knowledge than we assume, especially through travelling workers or guild apprentices. The truth is, every community had its version of how it's done, and if it kept the blizzard out, no one asked too many questions. By the end of a storm, your thatch might look like a snow-covered animal, shaggy, white and exhausted. But if it held, if it didn't leak or collapse or let the cold inside, you whispered a thank you. To the builders, the straw, the roof charm nailed to the ridgepole didn't matter who, you survived another round. Because in the medieval world, shelter wasn't measured by square footage or style. It was measured by whether it stood, whether it warmed you, and whether it kept the snow where it belonged. Outside, on the roof, not in your soup. Sometimes, the smartest way to survive a storm is to let the earth do the work. And when blizzards rolled in hard and fast, burying entire landscapes in silence and snow, some medieval communities did just that, by building their homes into the ground. It sounds primitive, maybe even desperate, but let's be honest, if you had no glass, no insulation and no central heating, hunkering down below the frost line suddenly sounds like a pretty smart move. These weren't caves, not exactly. You weren't living like a hibernating bear, though there were times it might have felt that way. These were semi-subterranean homes, half dug into hillsides, or partially buried with only the upper structure visible above the snow. In the far north, and in wind-blasted steppes or highland regions, it was just common sense. You're using the ground's natural insulation to protect you from the wind, the snow, and the worst of the bitter air. Below a certain depth, the earth doesn't freeze, even in the dead of winter, which means no drafts, less risk of collapse, and a surprisingly stable interior temperature. If you're picturing some muddy hole with a tarp over it, think again. These homes were often carefully constructed. The dugout portion formed the base, a sunken pit or trench, lined with stone or wood planks. Then a roof went on top, made from timber beams, brush and layers of turf. Sometimes the roof was low and flat, barely visible above the landscape. Other times it was angled, rising just enough to shed water and snow. A small smoke hole or a narrow chimney was cut into the top, and if you were lucky it didn't immediately smoke out the room every time you tried to cook. These earth homes had a lot of names depending on where you were. In the Scandinavian north they were called jordus or earth houses. In parts of Russia they were known as zemlyankas. In the British Isles, particularly in Scotland and Ireland, similar structures were called souterrains, though that term also applied to storage tunnels and other underground chambers. Regardless of the name, the idea was the same: get low, stay warm, and let the wind blow over your head instead of through your walls. Inside they were dark, yes, but they were quiet. You could sit by your small central fire and hear the storm above like a distant wave, crashing on a shore you didn't need to reach. Snow might pile up on the roof, but instead of threatening collapse, it acted as insulation. Your dugout world was self-contained, small and surprisingly snug, if a bit smoky and damp. Ventilation was tricky. If you didn't have a proper smoke vent, your eyes would burn, your throat would sting, and your walls would go slick with soot and moisture. So people got inventive. Some structures had double vents, one high for smoke to escape, one low for fresh air to enter. Others used angled stone tunnels to pull air through with the help of wind currents. A few even added a sort of chimney cap made from bark or clay to stop snow from falling directly in. And then there were the entrances. You couldn't just open a door into the wind and expect to stay warm. Most subterranean homes had some form of entry tunnel, a narrow hallway dug into the slope, sometimes with a second inner door or curtain to block out the gusts. In really harsh places, the tunnel itself would bend or curve, creating a natural windbreak. It took a little longer to come and go, but it kept your living space livable. It's worth noting that while these homes were warmer than above-ground huts, they weren't exactly cosy by modern standards. The floor was usually dirt unless you had time to lay stone or wood. The walls sweated. Mould was a constant battle, and they were dark. Sunlight barely reached inside even on clear days. But the trade-off? You didn't freeze to death, which for the average medieval farmer was a win. Modern archaeologists still debate how widespread these earth shelters really were. Some argue they were temporary dwellings, used only in the worst of winter, or by herders and travellers needing seasonal shelter. Others believe they were full-time homes in especially harsh climates. Excavations in parts of Scotland, Iceland and Eastern Europe have uncovered layered soot on stone walls, indicating years of use, not just seasonal occupancy. But since these structures often collapsed or were filled in after abandonment, evidence is scarce and patchy. There's also the question of who used them. Were these shelters for the poorest, those with no land to build proper homes, or were they a cultural adaptation, passed down through generations in regions where snow and wind were a regular threat? The answer, as usual, is probably both. In some places, earth homes were a fallback. In others, they were tradition. One fringe detail that pops up in oral traditions: some earth houses were said to be invisible to evil spirits. Maybe it was the low profile. Maybe it was the fact that snow covered them like a shroud. Whatever the reason, people believed that underground homes were spiritually safer during long winters. If the wind couldn't find you, neither could the ghosts. Of course, living half buried in the earth came with its own quirks. Vermin loved them. So did insects. Your firewood had to be stored above ground and carried in, meaning you braved the elements at least once a day. And the darkness. Let's just say people got very used to navigating by touch. Children could identify tools and bowls by feel alone. Candles were precious and rarely wasted. But ask anyone who's weathered a true blizzard in one of these homes and they'd tell you, it's worth it. You hear the wind screaming above you, feel the cold trying to claw its way down the tunnel, and you know it can't reach you. Not tonight. Not while you're below the frost, tucked in with fire, food, and the earth itself holding your walls together. Because sometimes survival isn't about standing tall. It's about going low, staying quiet, and letting the storm pass over your head like you were never even there. By now you've figured out that medieval survival wasn't just about structures or tools, it was about bodies. Your body, to be precise. And if you were fortunate enough to be born into a family with livestock, and no, that doesn't sound glamorous, and it wasn't, you quickly learned one of the oldest and least talked about secrets of winter survival: animal heat. That's right. Cows, pigs, sheep, chickens, all of them were more than food or trade. In the heart of a blizzard, they were your co-heaters, your fuzzy, grunting, farting radiators. You step into the barn, or maybe you never even left it. In colder regions, the barn wasn't a separate structure. It was part of the house, or more accurately, the house was part of the barn. The German term Einhaus comes to mind, a building that housed both animals and people under the same roof, divided by just a wall, or sometimes nothing more than a low partition of wood. You ate your stew 20 feet from a cow chewing cud. You slept hearing the slow exhale of pigs rooting in straw. Why? Because cows give off body heat. A lot of it. An average adult cow emits around 1,000 watts of heat. Multiply that by a couple of cows, throw in some goats, maybe a few pigs, and suddenly you're getting free thermal energy. It doesn't smell great, it's not sanitary by any modern standard, but when the wind is screaming outside and the roof's groaning under snow, the warmth of a cow can be the difference between life and death. And yes, people really did sleep close to animals. In some homes, especially in Scandinavia and alpine regions, animals were kept beneath the human sleeping quarters, barn on the ground floor, people above. The heat rose, the floor stayed warmish, and everyone made it through the night a little less frozen. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. In poorer homes or in one-room structures there was no floor separation. Animals might sleep at one end of the room while the family curled up at the other. Chickens roosted in rafters. Pigs lay in the corner. Cats and dogs. Not just pets, but part of the heating system. A few sleeping dogs under the blanket weren't just comfort, they were strategy. There's a charming and slightly disturbing detail from medieval Iceland. People sometimes let lambs sleep in the bed with children during extreme cold. Not beside the bed, in it, tucked under fur blankets. The rationale: keep the lamb alive and keep the kid warm. 2 birds, 1 woolly snuggle. It sounds cute until you remember that both kid and lamb were probably sleeping in the same clothes they'd worn for a week, and there was likely a little straw, a little mud, and a lot of smell involved. Scholars are still debating just how widespread this practice was. Some think the shared living space was more about convenience than heat, that animals indoors made it easier to monitor them, protect them from predators, or deal with birthing. That's certainly true. But we also have plenty of written and oral accounts that mention warmth as a major reason. You're not inviting a goat into your home in January because you like its personality. You're doing it because the alternative is freezing in your own bed, and the animals didn't seem to mind. For the most part, they settled in. They were fed, watered, and given straw. In return, they gave warmth, breath, presence. You get used to their rhythms, the snorting of a pig in the early hours, The rustle of feathers as a hen settles herself tighter, the occasional absurd crash when a goat knocks over a pot because, of course, it's a goat. Now, there were risks. Disease transmission was a thing, even if medieval people didn't fully understand it. More animals meant more lice, more fleas, more droppings. But on the hierarchy of medieval winter problems, those took a back seat to not dying of cold. You could clean up droppings in the morning. You couldn't reanimate a frozen corpse. Sometimes the animal-human relationship went even further. In parts of the Alps, families intentionally placed their beds directly above the stall area. No floor insulation, just a few wooden planks between the hay-filled stable and the sleeping chamber. At night you'd lie there and feel the gentle warmth rising from below. Not exactly central heating, but close enough. In rare but fascinating fringe cases, travellers or shepherds caught in unexpected storms would literally bury themselves in straw beside a cow or horse to survive the night. The animal's body heat, combined with insulation from the hay, created a kind of emergency shelter. It wasn't comfortable, and it wasn't guaranteed, but desperate people do what desperate situations demand. And for all the practical logic behind this arrangement, there's also something deeply human about it. You and your animals share the storm. You all breathe the same smoky air, eat from the same stored supplies, endure the same creaking roof. It blurs the line between indoors and barn, and reminds you that, out here, survival is communal. It's noisy, it's messy, it doesn't smell great, but it's warm. Of course, as spring returns, the living arrangements change. Animals go back outside, homes get aired out, bedding is burned or beaten clean. But in the thick of a January whiteout, there's no question where your priorities lie. Fire, food, shelter, and a fat breathing cow chewing cud 3 feet away. Because when the storm is howling and the walls are shaking, you don't care about appearances. You care about body heat, and the warm, earthy presence of something else that, just like you, wants to see the morning. When the snow gets deep enough to swallow fences and erase paths, and when the sky settles into that eerie, colourless grey that means it's not done dumping on you yet, there's a strange kind of logic that kicks in. Maybe the snow itself can help. It sounds backward, doesn't it? Like building a fire out of ice. But in certain parts of medieval Europe, people did exactly that. They used snow as a building material, not just something to survive. Welcome to the strange and clever world of snow shelters. And no, this isn't just an Inuit thing. There are echoes of this all across the medieval cold belt, from the high Alps to the Carpathians and beyond. Let's start with the basics. Snow can insulate. If you've ever been inside a snow tunnel or dug out a fort as a kid, you might remember how it muffles sound, stops the wind, and actually feels weirdly warm. That's because snow traps air, and air is a fantastic insulator, if it's kept still. So even though it might be -10 outside, a properly constructed snow shelter can hover just below freezing inside, which in medieval terms is practically tropical. Now, we're not saying that medieval peasants were carving out elaborate igloos with spiral staircases and skylights. But when caught out during travel, or in regions where winter was brutal and wood was scarce, people did turn to snow as a last resort. Hunters, soldiers, shepherds. They knew the land well, and they knew how to read snow the way a sailor reads the sea. If the drifts were thick and the air was dry enough to pack well, you could carve into the side of a snowbank and build yourself a makeshift cave. The simplest version was a trench shelter. You'd dig down into the snow until the wind was below your head, then lay branches or cloth over the top and pile snow over it. Or, if you had time and tools, you could cut blocks of hard-packed snow and build up a circular dome. It was a slow, exhausting process, especially with bare hands or basic tools, but it worked. Even just hollowing out a spot beneath an overhang or drift could mean the difference between frostbite and making it through the night. Evidence for this kind of snow sheltering exists more in oral history and survival folklore than in written records, but it's there if you look. In the Swiss Alps, tales of snow dens used by shepherds to survive surprise storms are common. In Russia, the Zavalinka was a kind of windbreak made of snow or earth that people built against the side of a hut. Later, that concept was turned into emergency shelters dug into snowbanks during travel. And in the Carpathians, there's an old saying that translates roughly to, "When the roof is sky and the walls are snow, sleep tight, but not long." Not poetic, but definitely practical. What's fascinating is how snow shelters were often seen as temporary, almost taboo. No one wanted to live in one unless they had to. You used it, survived, and moved on. Maybe that's why there's not much written about them, because admitting you had to dig a hole in a drift to make it through the night was kind of like admitting you'd lost the battle with winter. It was survival at its most primal. Still, some communities made snow part of their regular architecture. In Nordic countries, snowdrifts were packed tightly against the outer walls of buildings, deliberately, to block wind and seal out drafts. It looked like your house was being buried alive, but really you were just wrapping it in a layer of insulation. Some families even dug tunnels through the snow to reach the outhouse or the woodshed, creating a kind of temporary winter architecture that vanished with the thaw. Here's a quirky fact. In parts of Finland and Sweden, children played in elaborate snow kitchens carved into drifts. Tables, benches, even little bowls sculpted from ice. What started as play was also preparation. These kids were learning how to handle snow, how to work with it, how to see it not just as a threat but as a resource. That kind of cultural knowledge doesn't show up in textbooks, but it's passed down like treasure. Some historians question whether medieval people truly had the time or tools to build effective snow shelters on the fly. It's a valid point. If you're caught in a storm without a shovel or blade, digging through packed snow with your hands can be a death sentence. But the counter-argument is just as strong. When you live close to the land, you learn to carry what you need. A small hand axe, a belt knife, a wool cloak stiff with ice but still serviceable, and most importantly, knowledge. Knowing where to dig, how deep, and what kind of snow holds a roof. Of course, snow shelters weren't foolproof. A poorly packed roof could collapse. Wet snow could melt and soak you through. And once you were inside, it got damp fast. Breath alone would create condensation that could freeze on the walls. Still, compared to sleeping exposed on a hillside with wind slicing through your clothes, a snow cave felt like a blessing. There's also a certain strange peace to them. The way sound disappears, how the outside world becomes muffled and distant. Sitting in a hollow carved from the very thing trying to kill you, wrapped in furs, waiting for morning. It's a scene that plays out quietly in the survival memory of a dozen different cultures. And if you're lucky, one you only hear about in stories, not first-hand. Back in your village, the idea of sleeping in a snow cave seems absurd. You have walls, a fire, maybe even a cow snoring gently in the corner. But out there, on the road between hamlets, or caught on the trail when the wind turns mean, snow becomes your shelter, your curse, and your saviour. You curse it while you dig. You thank it when the cold stays out, and when the sky finally cracks open to show a single shred of blue, you climb out, stretch your frozen limbs, and leave no trace behind. Because the snow always reclaims what it gives. There's poor, and then there's medieval winter poor. If you're a peasant or a tradesman, you're surviving on barley bread, turnips, and the hope that your roof won't cave in under the weight of February. But if you're part of the church or nobility, things look different. Castles and cloisters, those great stone structures looming above the landscape, offered not only power and protection, but shelter that actually stood a chance against a blizzard. That is, if you didn't mind freezing in style. Let's start with the monastery. Imagine rows of quiet stone buildings arranged around a courtyard, the ground blanketed in snow, cloaked monks shuffling across flagstones with their heads bowed, breath rising like incense. Cloisters were often better prepared than most villages for winter, not because they were cosy, but because they were organised. Monastic life ran on routine and resourcefulness. There were systems in place, strict food storage, layered clothing protocols, and shared warmth. The architecture helped too. Thick stone walls retained heat, slowly absorbing it during the day and releasing it back into rooms at night. At least, that's the theory. In practice, stone gets cold, and unless you've got a roaring fire going constantly, you're basically living inside a beautifully carved freezer. Still, monks did what they could. They hung tapestries to block drafts, built inner walls to create warmer zones, and, in wealthier monasteries, used hypocausts, underfloor heating systems borrowed from Roman design, to warm chapels or bathhouses. These weren't common, but when they existed, you'd better believe the monks took full advantage during a blizzard. In fact, bathhouses were often still in use during winter, especially in Benedictine or Cistercian monasteries. Not as places of leisure, but of cleansing and discipline. Cold outside? Too bad. The rule of St. Benedict waits for no weather, and even though they weren't supposed to complain, monks found ways to express just how much they hated the cold. Marginalia, the doodles and drawings scrawled in the edges of illuminated manuscripts, often show monks huddled around fires, shivering. sometimes even glaring up at the snow like it personally insulted them. One famous image shows a monk warming his hands over a tiny brazier while glaring at a smug-looking cat curled up in the only truly warm spot. Medieval passive aggression at its finest. Now shift to a castle. You're highborn, noble, with a title and land and a hall full of retainers, but the snow doesn't care about your pedigree. Your great hall might have high ceilings and banners fluttering in the cold drafts, but unless your servants are constantly feeding the fire and blocking the windows, it's still cold enough inside to see your breath. Your walls are made of stone, your floors of worn slabs or creaking timber, and your windows, tiny slits, unless you're rich enough to afford glass. And even then it's probably crown glass, blurry and full of air bubbles, fitted in lead frames that leak heat like sieves. Still, castles had some tricks. For one, they were built for defence, and that included weather. Narrow hallways, thick walls, small rooms, these helped trap heat. Bedrooms were usually upstairs, away from the icy draft that hugged the ground floor. Fireplaces weren't just decorative, they were necessary, often built into every major room. Chimneys, a relatively newer feature in the High Middle Ages, made it possible to heat private chambers without filling them with smoke. Tapestries were a big deal. More than art, they were insulation. Hung on walls, draped across doorways, even used as canopies over beds. A thick woven tapestry could take the edge off a bitter draught, and they were portable, meaning they followed the lord or lady from residence to residence. It wasn't uncommon to pack them up along with silver and servants when moving between seasonal estates. And the beds. Oh, the beds. In a castle, a proper bed was less furniture, more fortification. Canopy overhead, heavy curtains all around, furs piled thick as mattresses, and hot stones wrapped in cloth tucked under the covers. You didn't just sleep in the bed, you climbed into it like entering a tent. Once the curtains were drawn, your body heat had a chance of actually sticking around. Servants would prepare the beds at night, sometimes pre-warming them with brass pans filled with coals. It wasn't luxurious by today's standards, but compared to a straw pallet next to a pig, absolute royalty. There's a scholarly debate about just how warm castles really were. Romantic films and modern TV shows tend to show roaring fires, cosy corners, and sunlight pouring in through wide glass windows. The reality: you'd be walking around in 3 layers of wool with a fur-lined hood, even indoors. Fires helped, sure, but the heat stayed close to the hearth. Move 10 feet away, and it was back to shivering. Servants often slept near kitchens, not for convenience, but because it was the warmest part of the building. One weird detail that pops up in castle inventories: foot warmers. Basically little wooden boxes with slatted tops and a small pan of coals inside. You'd rest your feet on top, the heat rising through your woolen stockings while you sat trying to read or sew without freezing your fingers off. Sometimes these were placed under tables, with long cloths draped over to trap the warmth underneath, creating a sort of mini heat cave where multiple people could hide their legs during meals or meetings. And let's not forget the food. Nobles ate better, even in winter. Salted meat, dried fruit, imported spices. If you were stuck indoors for weeks during a storm, at least your stew had flavour. Monks fared a little more humbly. Fish, root vegetables, bread. But they usually had enough to keep the hunger pangs from turning into something worse. Still, whether you were kneeling in a chapel or brooding in a stone tower, you weren't immune to the cold. You just had better tools to fight it. Fires, furs, hot wine spiced with cloves, servants who kept the hearth burning, and when the snow piled up against the door and the wind moaned down the chimney like a ghost with a grudge, you pulled the curtains around your bed, muttered a half-hearted prayer, and waited for spring like everyone else. Because in the end, whether you lived in a peasant's hovel or a baron's keep, winter had no favourites. It just had victims and survivors. Clothes in medieval times weren't fashion statements, they were survival systems. Layered, scratchy, heavy, and probably smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and wet wool. They were less about looking good and more about not dying. When the snow turned sideways and the wind bit through stone, the only thing between your skin and the icy fingers of winter was what you'd managed to wrap, drape, or stuff onto your body. And believe me, you got creative. Let's be clear, medieval clothing wasn't designed with blizzards in mind. It was made from what was available, mainly wool, linen, and if you were lucky, fur. Cotton was rare. Silk? Forget it. That was for royalty and church altarpieces. You're out here in itchy woolen tunics and hoping that you don't step in slush, deep enough to soak through your foot wrappings, which by the way are not socks as you know them. They're more like linen strips or simple woolen tubes. No elastic, no cushioning, just fabric wrapped tightly around your feet and ankles to keep frostbite at bay. So, you layer. That's the trick. And it's not elegant. Your base layer is probably a linen shirt, soft if it's old, scratchy if it's new. Over that you've got a woolen tunic, maybe two if you're expecting a long day outside, trousers made of thick wool or even coarse felt. On top of that, cloaks, layers of them. Cloaks lined with fur if you're lucky, tied at the neck, wrapped around the body like a cocoon. Hoods attached or separate, often pulled so far forward you can barely see. And then the fringe accessories, the things that make the difference between shivering and shivering less. Woolen mittens, sometimes with a thumb hole, sometimes just a tube. Hats made of felt or hide. Fur-lined boots if you're nobility, but for most people. Foot wraps, woolen socks, and leather shoes stuffed with straw. That's right, straw. It adds insulation. Not perfect, but better than letting the cold creep up from the ground and through the thin soles of your shoes. Some even put dried moss or animal hair inside their footwear for the same reason. The debate continues among historians about whether layering was a consciously planned strategy or just the result of necessity and improvisation. Some say medieval people didn't think about layers like we do today. They just piled on whatever kept them warm. Others argue that layering was well understood, especially among travellers, soldiers and herders who faced the elements regularly. Either way, the result was the same. Warmth was the goal, and looking like a walking hay bale was a fair trade. One surprisingly effective piece of the wardrobe? The humble belt. Belts weren't just for holding things, they were part of your thermal strategy. By cinching your tunics and cloaks tightly, you trapped heat closer to the body. Loose garments let in air and drafts. Tight layers created pockets of still air that actually insulated you better. Some folks wore two belts, one at the waist, one across the chest. Others tied bits of cloth around the legs, arms and neck, anywhere that wind liked to sneak in. Now let's talk fur. It was coveted, and for good reason. Fur-lined garments were warm, luxurious, and unfortunately expensive. The average peasant might never own real fur, maybe a bit of sheepskin passed down from a grandparent. But in the cities or among the wealthy, fur was everywhere. Squirrel, rabbit, fox, marten, each with its own status ranking. The soft underfur was sewn facing inward for warmth, the glossy outer side sometimes shown off if you were feeling smug. In monastic records you'll find fur allowances for scribes who spent long hours copying manuscripts in freezing scriptoria. Because even God's work gets cold fingers. There's even a fringe theory, still up for debate, that some peasants used layers of dried dung, sandwiched between cloth, as makeshift insulation pads. It sounds horrifying, and it probably was, but in desperate times people used whatever they could. The ammonia in dried dung has low thermal conductivity. Disgusting? Yes, but if it meant keeping your core warm enough to keep going, some poor soul probably gave it a try. Headwear was also essential. Heat rises, and in a thatch-roofed hut with no insulation, you're basically losing warmth like a leaking pot. So you wrap your head, wool coifs, felted caps, or fur hoods, anything to seal in what little body heat you're generating. You might even sleep with your hood on, tucked deep under your cloak, breathing into a shared blanket with your family. And speaking of sleeping, yes, you wore most of this to bed. Nightshirts existed, sure, but during a cold snap no one was stripping down. You went to bed in your layers, maybe with an extra cloak thrown over you, maybe with a dog curled up at your feet. If you were rich, you might have a warming pan. Hot coals slid under the blankets before bed. If not, you relied on your layers, your breath, and maybe your neighbour's elbow to stay alive until morning. One of the lesser-known facts about medieval cold survival is the bed-sharing system. Not romantic, strategic. Families, even unrelated travellers, would sleep side by side for warmth. Children in the middle, elders on the edges near the hearth, everyone wrapped in their own layers but sharing heat like huddled penguins. It was awkward, sure, maybe even frowned upon in certain settings. But when your teeth are chattering and the wind is clawing at the door, social norms become negotiable. Even with all this, you still weren't warm, not really. You were just not dying. Your hands and feet stayed numb most of the time. You learned to live with it. Pain meant circulation was still working. When you stopped feeling anything, that's when you started to worry. But there were moments, Brief, golden moments when the fire burned high, your clothes trapped just enough heat, and the wind dropped for a few hours. Maybe you were stirring the pot with your mittened hand, or sewing a patch into your tunic by the hearthlight, and you realised you weren't cold, not for a second. And in that second, it felt like you'd won. Not the war, but a battle. One tiny wool-wrapped battle in a long snow-covered campaign. Because in the medieval world, survival was stitched, layered, belted, and stuffed together one piece at a time. And if it meant looking ridiculous, smelling like sheep, and wearing half a haystack on your feet, well, so be it. Warmth first, dignity later. By day 7 of the storm, something shifts. Not outside, but inside. The fire is still flickering, the snow still hissing against the shutters, but your woodpile is noticeably smaller. The good logs are gone. What's left are the knotty, damp pieces that spit and smoke more than they burn, and even those are running low. That's when the quiet panic starts to creep in. Because in the medieval world, when the firewood runs out, your list of fuel alternatives gets real short and real weird, real fast. You've already burned through the obvious stuff. The tidy stack of dry logs you split back in autumn, gone. The bundles of kindling tied up with twine and stored near the hearth, history. You might still have a few bits of bark, maybe a broken stool or a cracked cartwheel tucked away in a corner, but those are emergency reserves. Spoiler, you are now in the emergency. And so, you do what medieval families have done for centuries. You burn whatever doesn't run away. This is where the line between firewood and everything else starts to blur. Dried cow dung, for instance. Known affectionately in some circles as meadow chips or patties, it was gathered during the warmer months, shaped into flat discs and left to dry in the sun. Once hardened, they could be stacked like bricks and burned steadily, giving off a surprisingly consistent heat. The smell? Less than ideal. But after 3 days of snow clogging your chimney and your toes turning blue, you stop caring. Peat was another lifeline, if you lived somewhere boggy enough to harvest it. In places like Ireland and Scotland, peat cutting was a whole seasonal industry. You dig it out in long bricks, stack it in pyramids, and let it dry over summer. By winter, you had an earthy, smoke-belching fuel that smelled like wet soil and burnt moss. But it worked. Some say peat fires have a kind of soul to them, with their slow smoulder and deep crackle. Others say they're just smoky nightmares. Either way, they'll keep you from freezing. But maybe you didn't have dung. Maybe you didn't have peat. What then? You start looking around your shelter differently. That broken bench in the corner. Burn it. The busted loom leg? Into the fire. A basket that's too frayed to carry anything? Strip the reeds and feed them in. You become an opportunistic scavenger of your own home. A table might be useful, sure, but can you sit at a table if you're dead from exposure? There's an old joke from 14th century France, one of those bleak little quips tucked into marginal notes in a ledger, that says, "In winter, a poor man's chair has 3 legs. The 4th is in the fire." Not exactly stand-up material, but painfully true. We have accounts of people burning everything from barrel hoops to roofing beams. One desperate farmer, trapped by snow in a Polish village, reportedly tore apart the wooden slats of his own bed and burned them one by one, sleeping on the floor as the storm raged. Another tale, less verified but often told, speaks of a family burning the wooden handles of their tools, figuring they could carve new ones come spring, but only if they lived to see it. And what about clothing? It's rare, but there are stories, some likely exaggerated, of families burning spare garments or straw-filled shoes to make it one more night. Even small things became fuel, leftover rushes from the floor, dried herbs that hadn't been eaten, old books no one could read. In monasteries, the idea of burning sacred texts was almost unthinkable, but in an unsupervised cloister during a freak blizzard? Well, sometimes survival trumped scripture. Some wealthier households had reserves, wine casks, shipping crates, even furniture made from softer woods that could be sacrificed. But for most, once the woodpile was gone, the home became a slow, smoky furnace of its own destruction. Every item in the house, from rakes to roof beams, entered a mental list. Burn now, burn later, burn only if desperate. And while fire kept you alive, it also risked killing you. The more you burned poor quality fuel, the smokier your shelter became. Chimneys weren't always up to the task, and vents could clog with snow. Smoke inhalation was a silent threat, especially at night. Some families slept in shifts, not just to tend the fire, but to keep watch in case the smoke thickened too much, or the embers sparked something they couldn't put out. There's a strange, sad intimacy that comes with burning your own possessions. Every item that goes into the fire carries memory. The cradle that once held your child, the spinning stool your grandmother used, the table where your family shared bread. All of it. Wood now. Fuel now. You watch the flames curl around it and tell yourself it's just a thing. Just one more hour of warmth, and then you go out looking. When the wind lets up even a little, someone ventures into the snowdrifts. A son, a neighbour, maybe you, wrapped in everything you own and tethered to the door with rope. You scan the blank landscape for anything. Fallen branches, storm-snapped limbs, driftwood if you're near the sea. The snow is waist deep, your fingers numb inside your gloves. But then, luck. A broken fence post. A dead tree half exposed. You hack at it with your knife or hatchet if it's not frozen solid, and drag it back like treasure. There's a fringe survival trick mostly found in Norse sagas, where people boiled bones for days not just to eat the marrow, but to dry them enough to burn. Bonefire doesn't burn hot, but it burns long. In extreme cases, even antlers were tossed in. Anything organic with a chance to catch flame. It wasn't pretty, but then again, neither was freezing. Some modern historians debate how widespread these burn-it-all practices were. They argue that perhaps we overestimate the desperation, that most households rationed better or shared wood communally. That's probably true in some places, but the records of harsh winters, particularly during the Little Ice Age between the 14th and 19th centuries, don't lie. There were times when the snow came early and stayed late, when no amount of planning could stretch the woodpile far enough. And then, you burned everything except your hope. So tonight, as you sit by a hearth that smells less like pine and more like desperation, watching the last chair leg curl into embers, you tell yourself it's worth it. Because tomorrow, the sun might come out. Or it might not. But either way, you'll be warm for now. And in this kind of winter, now is everything. It's easy to think of winter as something you endure from inside, but not everyone had that luxury. Some people, by choice or by grim necessity, had to move through the blizzard. Messengers, pilgrims, shepherds, soldiers, traders, monks on journeys of penance. Whatever the reason, people found themselves caught outside in conditions that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. No homes, no hearths, just a white world of wind and silence. And when that happened, when the storm blinds you, and your path disappears under a growing white void, you did what any desperate human would do. You made a shelter on the spot, or you didn't make it at all. This isn't the kind of building that takes days or even hours. You don't have time. You've got maybe an hour, less if you're soaked. The wind is slicing sideways and your fingers are already stiff, the snow finding its way into the seams of your cloak, melting down your back, freezing against your belt. You need cover, and fast. That's when snow caves, wind shelters, and the occasional half-buried livestock carcass become the difference between death and tomorrow. Let's talk snow caves. Again, not the decorative kind with snowmen and playful tunnels. We're talking clawing your way into the side of a drift or snowbank, hollowing out a pocket just big enough to fit your body, and praying the roof doesn't collapse. If you had a blade, a stick, or even a horn, you could shape it faster. The key was to dig inward, not down. You left a small air hole, packed the ceiling smooth to avoid drips, and curled inside, knees to chest, cloak wrapped tight. It wasn't warm, not really. But the wind stopped. The screaming of the storm became muffled, and in that silence, you had a chance to last the night. There are dozens of folk records of these kinds of impromptu shelters. A shepherd in 14th century Wales who cut a windbreak out of a snowdrift and survived 3 days until the weather cleared. A messenger in Livonia, modern Latvia, Estonia, who used his horse's saddle as a frame for a snow hut. He lost 3 fingers to frostbite but delivered his message. Priorities. You didn't even need a snowbank necessarily. If you had a cloak and some rope, you could dig down into a drift, pitch your cloak like a tent using sticks or your own pack, then pile snow over the top. Inside it was dark, damp and close, but livable. In some Slavic regions, travellers even carried curved sticks, primitive snow hooks, just for building these emergency shelters. It was survival gear as essential as a knife or a water flask. And when there wasn't snow to dig into, just howling, open land, then you turned to whatever you had. Rocks, trees, ruined buildings. You crouched in the lee of a stone wall, built up a makeshift screen of brush or turf, and did your best to trap your own body heat. In the mountains, people used what were known as storm cells, small, partially buried stone structures built along known routes, stocked with fire-starting kits, dry straw, and sometimes even food. They were the medieval version of emergency roadside shelters, and they saved lives more than once. But maybe you had nothing. Maybe you were caught alone out in the open, and the storm came faster than expected. Then you did the unthinkable. You lay down under your cloak, pulled your hood tight, curled into a ball and let the snow bury you. It sounds insane, but snow can insulate, and in the absence of shelter it's better than wind. People have survived nights this way. Barely. The key is to wake up. Keep shifting. Don't fall too deeply asleep. Because in sleep, the cold gets in. Of course, not everyone was lucky. There are grim records, so many, of travellers found frozen where they fell, huddled under a tree root, slumped against a stone marker. One traveller in the 1320s Hungary was found upright, snow packed around his body, frozen with his arms around his satchel. He hadn't moved for hours, his legs were buried, his eyes were open, and he was holding a handful of bread. Then there were the fringe survival techniques. Let's talk about animals. If you were travelling with a horse, you had a better chance. You could stand in its wind shadow, use its body for warmth. In extreme cases, brace yourself. People slit open dead animals and crawled inside for shelter. It sounds like myth, but it's recorded in Norse sagas and even in some Russian survival accounts. Horrifying? Yes. Effective? Absolutely. The inside of a horse carcass could stay above freezing for hours, and if it meant waking up instead of dying in the dark, you made your peace with it. Modern scholars sometimes raise eyebrows at these stories. Surely not, they say. Surely no one actually did that. But they underestimate desperation. When your ears have gone numb and you can't feel your feet, your brain doesn't think in terms of dignity. It thinks in terms of fire, food, and not being found as a stiff statue come morning. Some travellers carried tiny wax fire starters or flint kits in waterproof pouches. Others packed dried lichen or pine sap wrapped in cloth, fuel that would catch with the tiniest spark. If you could get a fire going, even a small one, even briefly, your chances skyrocketed. Fire in a whiteout was not just heat, it was courage, a signal, a psychological lifeline. And then there were prayers, lots of them. Some said to St. Christopher, patron of travellers. Others whispered names of obscure saints who might, maybe, have your back. You muttered as you dug your shelter. As you curled up, you pleaded not to sleep too deeply. You promised better offerings come spring. You vowed to stay off the road next time, knowing full well that if you lived, you'd probably be back out again within the month. Because movement was life, and risk was part of survival. You didn't always have the option to wait out a storm. Food had to be delivered, flocks had to be tended, letters had to reach their destinations, even if it meant crawling through snow with windburnt cheeks and frostbitten toes. So if you're ever tempted to romanticize medieval winter, the quiet, the hearths, the cozy furs, remember the travellers, the ones who didn't have walls, the ones who faced the white wilderness head-on, carrying nothing but courage, a cloak, and the knowledge that shelter wasn't always a place. Sometimes it was just a hole in the snow, a hope in your chest, and the stubborn will to still be breathing by sunrise. It's not glamorous, but if you want to understand how people survived medieval winters, you have to look in the barn. Not the chapel, not the Lord's Hall, not even the cottage hearth. Go out to that frost-bitten, hay-smelling, manure-steamed rectangle of timber and listen. The barn was more than a place to store animals and tools. In winter, it was a beating heart, a reservoir of food, heat, labour, and, most surprisingly, design inspiration for shelter itself. Let's start with the obvious. Animals lived there, and animals meant warmth. We already talked about the benefit of keeping livestock close, but in many regions, especially in the harsher climates of northern and eastern Europe, the barn and the living quarters weren't just adjacent, they were fused. The longhouse model, common from the British Isles to the Baltic, was simple and effective. One long building, people at one end, animals at the other, with a shared roof and often no internal wall. Just a partial partition or a raised platform separating human beds from hooves and horns. It sounds chaotic, and it was, but it was also genius. The animal's body heat rose and filled the space. warming the living area with no extra fuel. And the layout meant easier access to care for them during storms. You didn't have to dig a path through snow every morning just to check on your cow. You were already basically roommates. Now, if you were wealthier, you might have a detached barn or stable. But even then, its design mirrored that same principle of heat conservation. Barns were built low to the ground to reduce wind exposure, and their walls were often thick with timber or packed daub. Roofs were steep and thatched, designed to shed snow rather than hold it. If the snow did accumulate, it added insulation. You'd see villagers packing snow around the base of the barn on purpose. Counterintuitive maybe, but effective. Snow on the outside meant fewer drafts sneaking in. But the barn wasn't just a shelter for animals, it was a pantry too, and that made it a survival engine. Hay, grain, root vegetables, dried herbs, all of it was stored there, and all of it had to stay dry and accessible. So barns were often built with raised wooden floors or slatted platforms to allow airflow and prevent moisture buildup. Haylofts were elevated to protect the harvest from rodents and rising damp. You'd throw hay down from above, sometimes directly into the animal stalls below, minimising trips and keeping the inside of the structure warmer with less movement. And when storms got truly bad, the barn sometimes became your second home. There are reports from rural Ireland, Poland and the mountain villages of France that during the worst storms families slept in the barn itself. Not because they preferred the company of goats, but because the cottage was too cold, or the firewood had run out, or the thatch was leaking. The barn, with its hay, body heat and sheer volume of life, was a backup shelter. In some traditions, it was even built with this dual purpose in mind. You might find a small corner of the loft cleared out, a place where children or the elderly could lie down in emergencies. Straw bedding, dry and warm, was better than a wet bed back in a crumbling hut. One odd fringe tradition, in some regions of Scandinavia, it was common to build miniature barn beds in the corners of the main livestock area. These were boxed-in wooden sleeping compartments, like closets with a mattress of straw. During severe blizzards, shepherds or stable hands would sleep there, taking turns feeding animals through the night or just riding out the storm. Think of it as a medieval version of a bunk in a fallout shelter. Tiny, cold, practical and just barely good enough. Food stored in the barn had to be rationed carefully. A storm might last days, but the true threat was the aftermath. If snow covered the fields, or roads were impassable, or fodder couldn't be brought in, then the barn had to carry the village through the leanest times. You could eat turnips and onions for weeks if you had to. Hay could be stretched for animals with careful management. But if the barn failed, if the roof caved in, or rodents spoiled the grain, you weren't just in trouble, you were doomed. That's why in some villages the barn was given more attention than the house. Roof patched first, walls reinforced, doors kept tight, with extra crossbars to resist drifting snow. You'd rather be cold in your bed than watch your food stores mould. There's debate among historians about just how often barns were dual-purpose like this. Shelters and food storage and fallback housing all in one. Some argue that barns were too filthy for humans to live in, even temporarily. Others point out that medieval standards of cleanliness weren't exactly modern to begin with, and that practicality always overruled pride. If the barn was warm, dry, and smelled vaguely of livestock urine, well, so did everything else. And remember, the barn was social. It was where neighbours helped each other, where children learned to tend animals, where you traded gossip while sweeping hay or collecting eggs. In winter, it was also where you went to move, to stay active when the cottage was too cramped. You'd muck stalls just to warm up, or brush the animals, or sit with a sick sheep in your lap and hope your body heat bought it another night. One curious, often overlooked element of barn architecture was the use of straw insulation walls, temporary barriers made of bundled straw or reeds stacked along the inner walls during winter. These absorbed moisture, blocked wind, and added a few crucial degrees of warmth to both the livestock and the humans hovering nearby. When spring came, you'd pull them down, compost them, or feed them to animals. And if you ever wondered how medieval people marked the changing of seasons during long snowbound months, look to the barn again. The sounds changed. In deep winter, it was silent except for the shifting of hooves and the occasional lowing of a cow. But when the birds returned, when lambs bleated in the cold mornings, when you caught the first hint of thawing mud, that's when you knew you'd made it. Because in a world where food was life and warmth was everything, the barn wasn't just a building. It was a buffer, a backup, a quiet, straw-scented promise that even in the depths of winter, there was still a place to go. A place where the snow didn't matter quite as much, where the breath of animals and the scratch of hay underfoot meant you weren't alone. You were inside something alive, and sometimes that was enough. When the storm rolled in, it didn't just bury individual homes, it buried entire villages. Roofs vanished under snowdrifts, footpaths disappeared, landmarks you'd known your whole life turned into strange white hills. It was like the landscape hit reset, and you were left navigating a blank slate. In that kind of silence, survival wasn't just about what you had, it was about what everyone had. Because in medieval winter, the village itself became the shelter. Forget modern ideas of isolated nuclear households. Most medieval communities weren't just clusters of houses. They were interdependent webs of shared labour, pooled resources, and tight-knit memory. When the weather turned cruel, the individual home mattered less than the network. You survived through the group, not just because it was nice or kind, but because if you didn't, people died. The village functioned like a living organism. When one part started to fail, say, a family's roof collapsed under the snow, or their firewood ran out, other parts stepped in. A neighbour shared fuel. Someone offered space by their hearth. You loaned your last dry cloak knowing that come spring they'd return the favour, or something close to it. These weren't acts of charity, they were acts of insurance, because you knew your turn would come. Some communities even had formalised systems for this. In places like medieval Scandinavia and parts of the Alps, the Almenning principle applied, not just to land but to survival. Shared forests, shared grazing fields, and in winter, shared responsibilities. Certain barns or longhouses were designated as communal refuge points, where the elderly, the orphaned or the sick could shelter during the worst storms. In monastic villages, the church sometimes maintained guest quarters for wayward travellers or locals whose homes had become uninhabitable. Call it hospitality if you want. It was also disaster response. Food too was a communal matter in bad winters. Grain stores were sometimes shared, rationed by the village reeve or priest. Yes, there was hoarding, and yes, disputes broke out. But more often than not, there was enough neighbourly pressure and just enough God-fearing humility to keep things balanced. Bread ovens might be shared. The largest hearths took in extra families. Women cooked in shifts. Men dug paths between homes, sometimes tying ropes from house to house so people could move safely between them without getting lost in the whiteout. And when the storm was especially cruel, they'd all huddle together. You'd see 10, maybe 15 people pressed into a single cottage, lying shoulder to shoulder on the straw-covered floor, cloaks overlapping, breath misting in the smoky air. Children curled together like kittens, elders wrapped in extra cloth seated closest to the fire. Sleep came in shifts. Conversation flickered in and out. Old stories were told not just to pass the time, but to anchor everyone in something that wasn't the cold. You survived by proximity, literally and emotionally. One bizarre fringe practice from Eastern European villages: storm marriage. No, not legally binding, and definitely not romantic. But in some communities, if a young couple found themselves snowed in together without family nearby, say, caught returning from market or mid-visit, it was considered taboo to let them freeze separately. So they were allowed, encouraged even, to shelter together under one cloak or in one bed. If they lived, the village often treated them as unofficially betrothed, not because of scandal, but because of survival. 2 bodies meant more heat meant more life. Children, interestingly, were often given the most structured roles during communal snowbound periods. They fetched water, if any could be found, not with buckets, but with blocks of ice chipped from nearby streams and carried in linen slings. They were also the fire watchers, not trusted to stoke it, but trained to watch, to notice if it got too low or smoked too much. In some places they sang songs to it, not just to pass time, but because the rhythm helped keep them alert. One old rhyme goes something like, "Fire high, don't die, keep us warm, or we shall cry." Not exactly poetry, but effective. Scholars have debated how much of this cooperation was idealised in later retellings. Maybe communities weren't as cohesive as the stories suggest. Maybe resentment simmered. Maybe debts weren't always repaid. Probably all true. But winter has a way of stripping life down to the essentials. Grudges fade when you're handing your last dry log to someone else's child. Selfishness shrinks when you're sleeping 4 to a blanket and someone starts coughing in the dark. The physical layout of villages even reflected this instinct for cohesion. In colder regions, houses were clustered tightly, not just for defence or convenience, but for access. You needed to be able to knock on your neighbour's shutter in the middle of the night and say, "We need help," and they needed to be able to answer without trekking across a frozen wasteland. Paths between homes were shovelled constantly, and when the snow was too deep, you dug tunnels. That's not a metaphor. In especially harsh winters, villagers in highland regions carved waist-deep trenches between cottages so people could walk without vanishing into the drifts. Children played in them, dogs got stuck in them, but they were lifelines. One curious tradition, the blessing bell. In some small French and Swiss villages, the church bell wasn't just for services. During storms, it was rung once an hour by whoever could reach it, often the village priest or a designated elder. Not for worship, but as a signal, a sonic lifeline to help anyone lost in the storm find their way back. The bell told you, "Here we are, we're still alive. Follow the sound." It's easy to imagine that in these moments the village became more than a place. It became a single entity, a huddled body with many arms, many voices, many fires flickering in the dark, and when the snow finally stopped, when the sun returned and the world blinked awake under a glittering crust of white, it was the village that emerged. Scarred, perhaps. Hungry, definitely. But together. Because in the medieval world, no one really survived a blizzard alone. The home kept you warm. The fire kept you alive. But the village, those neighbours, that bell, those trenches dug by hand, the village is what brought you through the cold. You're half asleep by the hearth, the fire crackling low when it happens, the sound you weren't expecting and definitely didn't want to hear. A low rolling rumble. At first you think it's thunder, but thunder doesn't shake the floor. The timbers above groan. Cups rattle on the shelf. Someone across the room stiffens. Then silence. Long. Too long. And that's when the shouting starts. The mountains moved. Avalanches. They're not just modern ski resort disasters. They've been crashing down onto medieval villages for as long as people have been foolish enough to build near slopes. And sometimes, in the right conditions, they came with no warning at all. But other times, you got lucky. Someone heard it, or saw the first shift of snow peel off a peak, or, strangest of all, someone heard a bell. The medieval world had its own early warning systems. Some were clever, some were accidental, and a few were downright eerie. Let's start with the most basic. The sound of the snow. Snow is silent until it isn't. In certain conditions, just the right kind of thaw and freeze, you might hear the telltale crack, followed by a low whoomp as a cornice gives way. Old shepherds in the Alps described it as the breath of the mountain, the moment when stillness exhaled. If you heard that, you ran. But most people didn't get a warning from the landscape. They got it from something man-made, church bells. It sounds like superstition, and maybe part of it was. But in more than one snowbound region, the ringing of bells was used to ward off or warn of avalanches. The idea was that a steady ringing could calm the air, or that loud vibrations might trigger small slides before they built into larger ones. A preemptive strike, basically. In Switzerland and Austria, for example, you'll find medieval records of monks instructed to ring the bell twice per hour during heavy snowfall. Not for prayer, but to shake loose the devil's drape, as one odd phrase put it. And while the logic was half folklore, half trial and error, it wasn't entirely wrong. Sound can trigger snow movement under the right conditions, though probably not in the thunderous dramatic way the stories suggest. More importantly, bells served as a rallying point. If you were out in the snow and heard a bell, it gave you something to orient toward. An audio landmark in a landscape wiped clean of features. Some villages even appointed a watch bell ringer during winter storms, an old man usually, or someone too frail to work the fields. His job was simple: listen and ring if anything seemed wrong. In that sense, the bell wasn't just an alarm, it was a pulse. As long as it rang, the village was alive. There were more tactile methods too. In avalanche-prone areas, homes were sometimes built with small windows facing uphill, not for the view, but to spot the first signs of a slide. These were called death windows in certain superstitions. Grim, but practical. If you saw snow racing down, you had seconds to act. Families kept emergency ropes by the door. If someone was buried, others could follow the line, start digging. Avalanche rescue in the medieval era was rudimentary. No dogs, no beacons, just shovels, hands, and hope. If you knew where someone had been standing, you started there. If you didn't, you dug where the snow looked wrong. Locals talked about the texture, snow that clots like flour. Sometimes they pushed sticks straight down into the drifts, hoping to strike clothing or hair or skin still warm. You listened for cries, muffled and desperate, though snow could silence even a scream within minutes. One recorded account from 1378, in a French alpine village, tells of a family that survived an avalanche because they had taken shelter in their root cellar. The snow flattened their home but passed over the underground chamber, leaving them trapped but alive. They dug out 2 days later using a wooden ladle and the broken handle of a butter churn. You can't make this stuff up. Well, you could, but the records suggest you don't need to. Then there's the weird fringe belief, avalanche ghosts. In some places, particularly remote parts of Scandinavia and Slavic territories, people believed that avalanche victims could not rest until their bodies were found, that their spirits wandered the drifts, whispering, causing cold spots, freezing door latches. These weren't terrifying ghosts, more sad and stubborn. A few old songs were even sung while digging. Don't wander, don't weep, we are near, we will keep. A melody to guide the dead, or to give comfort to the living who didn't want to think about dying under snow. It wasn't just avalanches. Bells served other winter purposes too. In lowland villages they warned of ice breaking on rivers, of wolves sighted near the livestock pens. In cities they rang out for fire, because yes, even in a frozen landscape fire remained one of the biggest threats. Sparks and snow make for a bad combination when the rooftops are dry thatch. But the avalanche bell was different. It came with dread. It wasn't the sound of celebration or mourning or summoning the faithful. It was a noise that said, brace yourself, something might be coming, and we're out of time. Historians disagree on how much people feared avalanches, or how common they truly were. Some argue that our modern imagination, fueled by disaster documentaries and dramatized tales, overstates the danger. That most medieval snow damage came from roof collapse, not mountain slides. Others point to the burial records, the surviving songs, the stone markers at the base of slopes inscribed with names and crosses, and they say no. This was very real. And perhaps that's the most striking thing. Even without modern sensors or meteorological data, people knew. They watched the mountains. They listened to the way the snow settled on their eaves. They tied ropes to doorposts. They rang bells into the blank white sky. Not because they knew it would work, but because doing something always beats doing nothing. So the next time the wind picks up and you hear a distant bell, maybe from a church, maybe from a memory, imagine it ringing through snow so deep it swallows trees, through valleys where footsteps vanish in seconds, through a village where someone stirs in their bed, heart racing and whispers, "It's coming." And then, just maybe, it passes by. The winter of 1315 didn't just arrive, it descended, like a wet grey curtain that refused to lift. The air felt heavier, the soil refused to dry, crops sagged before they could ripen. It began, as so many disasters do, not with a bang, but a long, slow rot. And when the first real snow of that year fell, blanketing an already battered landscape, it wasn't just the cold people feared, it was the hunger that followed behind it like a shadow. This wasn't a one-off bad season. This was the beginning of what historians now call the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, and it changed everything. It wasn't only about failing crops or colder temperatures, it was about the terrifying domino effect that a string of terrible winters could unleash. And if you're a peasant living in a village perched between a muddy road and a half-flooded field, you don't know this is a historical event. All you know is that your potatoes didn't come up, your cow's gone dry. And now, with snow falling heavier than anyone expected for late autumn, you're looking at your meagre shelter and wondering, how many people in this house will survive until spring? That year's winter hit after one of the wettest summers anyone could remember. Fields flooded, grain moulded in the ground, hay couldn't be dried for winter feed. When the temperature dropped, the land was already weak. And so were you. By the time the blizzard arrived, you weren't just cold, you were starving. Homes that had once stocked up for winter with barrels of grain, cured meat, dried apples, empty. Firewood was scarce, sure, but food was even scarcer. And when you have no food, your body starts losing the battle with the cold almost instantly. Fat is fuel. Without it, the chill cuts deeper, settles in your bones, makes you slow, makes you careless. People burned their last logs, they tore down walls to feed the hearth, and when that wasn't enough, they turned to more desperate things. There are records, gruesome, sorrowful, of people boiling leather shoes, eating grass, bark, even worse. Chroniclers at the time tried to downplay it, but the stories persist. One monk wrote that children were taken from the graves and boiled. Whether it happened once or often or at all isn't the point. The fear that it might was real. In towns and cities, the famine struck with cold efficiency. Markets had nothing to sell. Bakers were forced to use mouldy flour. People lined up with coins in hand, hoping for a crust of bread, only to be turned away. The winter storms only worsened things. Roads were impassable. Grain shipments froze in wagons or sank in thaw-flooded rivers. Horses starved. Oxen died in the yoke. A kingdom doesn't move when it's buried in snow. Out in the villages, it was worse. You knew every meal you didn't eat was one more you might have later, so you rationed. You lied to your children, told them you'd already eaten. You slept more, hoping to conserve energy. You clung to fire like it was your last connection to life, and every day you checked on your neighbours, not always to help, but sometimes just to see who had less. Communities began to fracture, the great comforting unity of the village tested by gnawing hunger and creeping cold. Some helped one another, splitting the last turnip, sharing a corner by the hearth. Others bolted doors, refused visitors. There are court records from 1316 of entire families starving behind locked shutters, their neighbours unaware or unwilling to check. But there were also stories of endurance, of people who dug tunnels through the snow to reach the church and pray for mercy, of priests who opened their cellars and gave their own food to the poor, of children who walked miles through waist-deep snow to beg grain from monasteries, and who returned days later with nothing but a small sack and frozen toes, saying, they gave all they had. There's a haunting fringe belief that grew popular during these years, that the snow itself was punishment, that it had been sent not as weather, but as judgment. Some claimed it never melted, only sank into the earth like a burial shroud. People began to see omens in everything. A crow sitting on a snow-covered roof meant death. A snowfall on a saint's feast day meant 7 more weeks of famine. Entire sermons were built around this imagery. One bishop declared, God has covered the world in white that we might see how dark our souls have become. Whether or not you believed it, the feeling stuck. Snow wasn't just cold, it was a silence that sat heavy over the land, a stillness that meant nothing is growing and nothing will grow. It covered corpses, it blanketed empty fields, it reminded you that the world could be so quiet when it wanted to be. Some historians today argue that the winter of 1315 wasn't especially brutal by temperature standards. It's possible. Maybe it wasn't the coldest. But that misses the point. It wasn't just about degrees, it was about timing. The ground was already soaked and useless, the people already starving. When the snow came, it was like a lid placed firmly on the coffin. No more hope of planting, no more travel, no more miracles, and yet, somehow, some people lived. They scavenged. They sheltered together. They bundled their children in furs, shared the last of the animal feed, broke furniture to keep fires going one more night. They pulled hay from frozen thatch to stuff into cloaks. They sang songs hoarse and low as they stirred thin broth over fading embers. They said, we will last until spring, even when they didn't believe it. The winter passed eventually. It always does. The snow melted. The mud returned. The famine lingered for another year, maybe 2, but people adapted. Some changed how they built their homes. Stronger roofs, deeper cellars. Some never forgot. A grandmother would lean close to a child years later and whisper, in the year of the long snow, we burned the cradle. And the child would nod solemnly, as if that explained everything. Because in the medieval world, the cold wasn't always the killer. Sometimes it was just the curtain call, the final act in a tragedy that began months before, when the fields went quiet and the sky stopped cooperating. And when it snowed, it didn't feel clean or peaceful. It felt like the earth itself had decided to lie down. At some point you run out of the obvious fixes. The holes in the wall are patched, the fire is fed, and the cloak is wrapped as tight as it'll go. And yet the cold still gets in. It slithers under the doorframe, curls around your toes, seeps into your shoulders no matter how many layers you pile on. So what do? You get creative. Because in the medieval world, survival wasn't always about what you had. It was about what you could invent with what was lying around. And when it came to insulation, people turned to some downright strange, but shockingly effective materials. Let's start with straw. It's everywhere. On the floor, in the barn, stuffed into bedding, and come winter, jammed into every crack and seam you can find. If there's a draft, shove straw in it. Under the door, a thick mat of it. Between roof beams, pack it tight. It's not elegant, but it works. It traps air, it stays dry, mostly, and it's free. The trick, of course, is that straw also invites everything else. Bugs, mice, mould. But by mid-January nobody cares. You've got a rat scurrying across your loft at night. That's just nature's little trade-off for not waking up with frostbitten feet. Next on the list, moss. Soft, spongy, earthy-smelling moss. You might think of it as forest carpet, but medieval folks thought of it as natural insulation. It went between stones in the wall, into the soles of shoes, even into earthenware pots to keep liquids from freezing. Sometimes it was dried and stuffed into tunics for extra warmth around the chest or neck. It smelled like wet dirt and clung to your clothes, but when the wind whipped against your door you were glad for every damp green scrap packed into the frame. And then there's animal dung, yeah. You knew this was coming. Before you cringe too hard, remember, dry dung isn't just fuel, it's a building material. In many parts of Europe, people used it in Waldorf, and in winter, they leaned into its insulating powers. Cow dung mixed with straw formed an impressively thick plaster that dried rock hard and retained heat better than you'd expect. Some families even coated the insides of walls with an extra layer of dung plaster, before the first snow, smoothed flat with wooden paddles left to dry for days. The smell faded quickly, replaced by the omnipresent scent of smoke and damp wool. But the warmth? That stuck around. Sheep's wool, not just for clothing, was stuffed into window frames and worn as inner padding. Some particularly inventive folks in colder regions sewed patches of wool into their outer cloaks, not for style, but as a way to trap more heat across the shoulders and chest. Even dog hair got repurposed into insulation, especially in places where wool was scarce. You'd gather the brushings, roll them into crude pads, and line your sleeves or shoes. In the Baltic and Nordic regions, one curious material made a seasonal appearance: lichen. Specifically reindeer moss, though it's not actually moss, but a kind of hardy fungus. It was gathered in bundles, dried, and packed into wall gaps or under floorboards. It held heat surprisingly well and resisted moisture better than moss or straw. You'd find it crumbling out of wall joints in spring, grey-green and brittle, like the memory of the storm that had passed. Then there were the textiles. In winter you repurposed everything. That ripped tunic, cut it into strips and stuff it into cracks. That threadbare scarf, nail it over the doorframe. Bits of linen, old cloaks, wool socks with holes. None of it was thrown out. Every scrap was insulation material. In some households, people even wove thick winter mats specifically to be nailed onto the walls, like medieval drywall but fuzzy and full of patchwork. Another strange practice: feather thatch. Rare, and mostly found in communities with access to fowl, but there are records of people gathering malted feathers and mixing them with clay or wax to line small window openings. The feathers created an airy layer, trapping warmth. It wasn't common, and it probably stank to high heaven, but it turned a gaping hole into a vaguely tolerable wall. There's a fringe case from northern Russia, more folklore than fact, of families insulating their homes with fish skins. That's right, dried fish leather nailed over drafty door gaps. Supposedly, it kept out wind and held in heat. Supposedly it worked. Supposedly, it didn't smell too bad once it dried. No one seems eager to test this theory in modern reconstructions. And then we come to one of the simplest, most brilliant insulation tactics of all: shrinking the room. In winter, your whole world got smaller. Literally. People put up interior walls, temporary partitions made of wood, fabric, even reeds, to divide large rooms into cozier, heat-trapping spaces. A cottage that might sleep 6 in summer would become 2 or 3 rooms during the cold months, with everyone crammed into the warmest third near the hearth. These makeshift walls weren't solid, but they made a huge difference. Less space to heat, fewer drafts, more human bodies in a concentrated area. You built a bubble of livable warmth in the middle of a freezing house. There's even debate among scholars about whether this was a formal architectural strategy or just an organic evolution. Did people design for winter, or did they adapt to it after the fact? The answer is probably both. Archaeological remains show signs of seasonal modifications, temporary pegs in walls, soot layers concentrated in single areas, odd plank placements that suggest partitioning. The evidence may be patchy, but the logic is sound. And then there's the human layer, quite literally. The last, most reliable form of insulation was each other. People slept in close piles, families shared beds, extra animals came inside. You became part of the insulation system, breathing, sweating, shivering together. In some places, beds were built into the wall like alcoves, with thick curtains that sealed in the body heat of 2 or 3 sleepers. Some slept sitting up in groups, backs against the hearth wall, arms draped over each other. Not romantic, not even comfortable, but warm. Because that's what insulation meant in the medieval world. Not clean lines or fiberglass rolls. It meant stuffing old sheep dung into the cracks. It meant sleeping 3 to a bed. It meant looking at the hair clumped in your dog's brush and thinking, that could go in my boots. In modern homes, the warmth is hidden, in walls, ducts, wires, thermostats. Back then, warmth was visible, touchable. You knew exactly what was keeping you alive. You could feel it under your hands, scratchy or damp or smelling of earth. And when the wind howled outside, rattling your patched-together home, you didn't worry about whether it was pretty. You only cared that it worked. Because survival in winter wasn't about comfort. It was about insulation by any means necessary, even if it came with fleas. You wouldn't think windows could be a death sentence, but in medieval winter, they were basically architectural betrayals. The concept sounds nice, sunlight streaming in, a view of the frosty morning, maybe a deer wandering past the tree line. But reality was cold wind, ice creeping down the walls, and a hole in your shelter that sucked out every bit of warmth like it had a personal grudge against your comfort. Windows were the single weakest point in a home during a snowstorm, and unfortunately they were also really, really hard to get rid of. If you were rich, you had glass. Congratulations. You could now watch your expensive heat float out through leaded panes that did absolutely nothing to stop the cold. Medieval glass wasn't double-glazed or airtight. It was handmade, bubbly, uneven, and set in small sections held together by lead cames. Most of it was closer to being translucent than transparent, and it wasn't unusual to have windows that were permanently foggy or warped. Beautiful, sure. Functional? Not really. Cold seeped through every seam, especially when the wind pressed hard against the walls. On blizzard nights, tapestries were hung over the glass to seal it off entirely. But if you were poor, and let's be honest, most people were, you didn't have glass at all. Your window was likely just an opening in the wall, maybe a small square cut into the daub and framed with timber. In better months, it let in light and fresh air. In winter, it was a constant, frigid leak. So what did people do? They closed it. With what? Whatever they could. Wooden shutters were the go-to solution. Not decorative, but functional. Rough planks on hinges, secured with a latch or a wedge of stone. In places with lots of wind, you'd have double shutters, one inside, one out, with straw cloth packed between them. In especially brutal regions, people added sliding panels, early window covers that could be pulled across when the weather turned. Still, none of these options were airtight. The wind always found a crack. And snow? It had a habit of drifting right up the wall and pushing through like it had an invitation. Some families used horn instead of glass, a thin sheet of scraped and polished animal horn, stretched over the opening to allow a little light through while blocking most of the wind. It worked, sort of. Horn windows gave the room a strange yellowy glow, like you were living inside a jar of old soup. But it was better than letting the cold air pour in unchecked. A few enterprising households tried oiled parchment, stretched animal skin treated with oil or wax to become semi-translucent. It was stiff, fragile, and needed frequent replacing. But in a pinch, it kept out the worst of the wind. Of course, if you got too close with a candle, the whole thing went up like a torch. One monk in southern Germany reportedly lost half his writing hut when a parchment window caught fire during evening vespers. The manuscript he was copying, a calendar of saints' days, irony, preserved forever in soot. When the snow really came down, windows weren't just sealed, they were buried. Families packed snow around the outside, or even bricked up the opening entirely for the season. Light's a summer problem, one old saying goes. In winter we live by fire. Homes became darker, dimmer and smaller, but also crucially, warmer. People learned to read by firelight or not at all. Work was done in the daylight hours close to the hearth, and if you needed more visibility, you opened the door for 5 minutes and let in a little grey, then shut it fast before your nose froze off. One fringe technique comes from Eastern Europe, where in some places households hung layers of greased cloth over window openings. These were linen or wool dipped in animal fat or beeswax, then stretched taut and pinned over the hole. The grease repelled water, added thickness, and kept the cloth from stiffening into a frozen board. The downside, it reeked. But again, warmth first, dignity later. We know that many medieval homes simply didn't have windows at all, or if they did, they were so small as to be almost useless. Narrow slits that let in little more than a suggestion of daylight. In longhouses and roundhouses, the only light came from the central fire and a smoke hole in the roof. This sounds bleak, and it was. But there's a sort of efficiency to it. Less light meant less exposure. Less exposure meant less death. Some wealthier households tried to get clever. They built recessed windows set deeper into the wall with stone or timber framing to help block the wind. A few even added interior shutters that closed inward, forming a sort of insulation sandwich. In castles, where the walls were thick enough to accommodate such luxuries, you might find triple-sealed window bays, tapestried niches, and window seats that no one actually sat in until spring. There's a weird little debate among architectural historians about whether people really hated windows, or whether we're just projecting our modern expectations of comfort onto medieval structures. Some argue that windows were more symbolic than practical, status markers more than functional apertures. A cottage with no windows wasn't necessarily worse off. It was just different. A darker, more insulated life. One that felt safe when the snow came knocking. Because here's the truth. In winter, you didn't want a view. You didn't care about scenery. You wanted 4 walls, a roof, a fire, and maybe a hole to let out the smoke. Windows were beautiful in cathedrals, poetic in song, useful in spring, but in January during the storm of the century, they were liabilities. Glorious, drafty, frost-rimmed liabilities, so people covered them, buried them, pretended they weren't there. The light that mattered was the flicker of the hearth, the glow of a candle stub, the dull red of coals in the brazier. Because in a world where a single open shutter could freeze a baby in its cradle, beauty took a back seat. And your view? It was the fire in front of you, the blanket around your shoulders, and the knowledge that, at least for now, the cold stayed on the outside of the wall. Sometimes survival wasn't just about firewood and wool and plugging up holes in the wall with straw. It was about keeping spirits from cracking like frozen beams. When the world outside was buried in white and the air inside thick with smoke and silence, people turned to something ancient, universal, and slightly magical. Food, feasting, and the illusion of plenty. You couldn't banish winter, but you could fight it off for a night with a table full of hot stew, spiced ale, and stories loud enough to make the snow forget it was trying to kill you. Of course, this wasn't a party every night. Most of the time, winter meals were thin, repetitive, and heavy on whatever hadn't moulded in the root cellar. Cabbage, onions, dried beans. If you had meat, it was probably salted beyond recognition, and if you had bread, it was dense, dark, and filled with more filler than flour. But every now and then, especially around midwinter, people gathered to push back against the cold with a proper feast. These feasts weren't just about food, they were rituals, anchors, big communal exhalations that reminded everyone they were still here, still human, still fighting. They often revolved around key calendar dates, Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas, or local saints' days. In some places, even the coldest nights were marked by warmth. You ate, you drank, you sang, and for a few hours you pretended the storm outside wasn't real. Take Twelfth Night, for example, the feast marking the end of the Christmas season in much of medieval Europe. It was a chance to indulge before settling in for the long, dark trudge through the rest of winter. In noble households it meant roasted meats, honey cakes, and spiced wine. In peasant cottages it meant something more than usual. A meat pie, if there was still meat. Sweet porridge made with dried fruit. Maybe even eggs, hoarded carefully and brought out just for this. And there was always drink. Weak ale or mead brewed from summer honey. Mulled wine, if you were fancy, boiled with herbs and spices to warm the blood. Even fermented milk in some regions. Tart, strange but potent. Alcohol wasn't just for cheer. It raised body temperature, dulled the ache of cold, and made people more willing to tell stories, dance badly, and fall asleep in corners, snoring beside the hearth. One curious dish often served in winter gatherings across northern Europe was bread pudding, a way to use up stale bread, sweetened with honey or fruit, baked in clay pots near the fire. It filled the belly and felt like dessert even if it was cobbled together from scraps. There's even a record of a shepherd's wife in 14th century England who made a version using sheep tallow, sour cherries, and old ale-soaked barley, a kind of medieval fruitcake that reportedly could stun a goat at 20 paces, and food wasn't just consumed, it was shared. During communal feasts, wealthier villagers or the local manor lord might distribute portions to poorer families. A bone with some meat still on it, a loaf of bread, a hunk of smoked fish. These gifts weren't always generous, but they served a purpose. Keeping the village alive meant keeping everyone alive, at least until planting season. There's a strange fringe tradition from the Pyrenees, where a wooden log called the Tio de Nadal was brought indoors during December and fed scraps of food every night. Then, on Christmas Eve, children would beat the log with sticks until it pooped out presents or treats, hidden under a blanket. It sounds absurd and delightful, but the log wasn't just a toy. It was a symbolic hearth, a stand-in for the spirit of the home, the winter fire made playful and friendly. In lean years, the treats were simple: nuts, a bit of cheese, maybe a fig. Still, it gave children something to look forward to in the darkest days of the year. These feasts also served a social function. Winter was isolating. People barely left their homes unless they had to. Days were short, tasks repetitive, and cabin fever real. A gathering, even a small one, broke the spell. You laughed, you argued, you reminded yourself that the world was bigger than your own fire. People brought instruments, fiddles, lyres, drums, flutes carved from bone. Songs were shared like bread, with everyone joining in on the chorus, whether or not they knew the words. Some of these songs were devotional, carols, hymns, chants. Others were bawdy, absurd, or flat-out nonsense. One fragment from a 15th century Danish manuscript includes a song that, roughly translated, goes, "My goat has frozen, my ale is flat, my wife is sleeping with the cat." It's not exactly Shakespeare, but it gets the job done. And yes, some households had nothing to spare. In those cases, the feast became more symbolic. A candle lit, a prayer spoken, a single bite of something sweet saved from better months. Even pretending to feast had power. It told the cold, "You haven't won yet." Scholars argue about how much food was actually available for these winter gatherings. Some claim that the idea of regular feasting in peasant homes is romanticised, that most people were too malnourished to celebrate much of anything. Others point to records showing how important these rituals were, even in lean times. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. People found ways. They stretched what they had. They made it count. And the smells, those mattered too. A stew on the fire, even a thin one, was more than food. It was a sensory promise. You're not done yet. You still have something. The scent of cloves in wine, onions sizzling in grease, bread baking in ashes. These were winter's lullabies. So yes, survival in medieval blizzards was about structures and strategy. But it was also about moments. Tiny, golden moments when the fire was high, the pot was full, and someone was playing a crooked tune on a 3-stringed fiddle while the snow howled outside like a beast shut out in the dark. You weren't warm every night, you weren't full, but sometimes, just sometimes, you felt like you were. And in the dead of winter, that was its own kind of miracle. The fire's low, your stomach is finally full, or as full as it's going to get, and you're not going anywhere until the snow lets up. So what now? You sit back, maybe with your feet close to the embers, wrapped in a blanket that smells faintly of smoke and sheep, and someone, your grandmother, an old uncle, or maybe even the local priest who's stuck with your family for the storm, clears their throat and says, "Well, let me tell you a story." And just like that, the cold recedes a little. In a medieval winter, storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. Not because it gave you more heat or put more food on the table, but because it gave you something to think about other than dying of frostbite or running out of onions. Stories were the insulation of the soul. They filled long, dark hours. They taught lessons, passed on memories, and kept minds sharp when the world outside was frozen in place. You didn't read them, of course, not unless you were unusually literate or lived in a monastery. Stories were heard, not read. Oral tradition was the thread that tied generations together. The same tale, told and retold, shifting slightly each time, growing in the telling like snow piling up on a roof. And if you were lucky, your village had someone with the gift, a true storyteller. Not just someone who remembered the words, but someone who knew how to say them, with rhythm, with pauses, with voices for each character and just the right amount of drama when the monster crept close to the sleeping night. Many stories were cautionary. Winter, after all, has a way of making you dwell on death. There were tales of travellers who ignored the signs and walked into storms, only to be found frozen like statues by spring. Stories of spirits that haunted snow-covered fields, calling out in the voices of loved ones to lure victims from their shelters. One chilling tale from the north of England spoke of White Meg, a pale woman who knocked on doors during storms asking to come inside. If you let her in, she stole your warmth in the night. If you didn't, well, you might find your door flung open anyway by morning, snow covering your bed. But not all stories were grim. Many were filled with hope, with magic, with warmth as deep and comforting as a fire-warmed cloak. There were talking animals who led poor farmers to treasure, wily peasants who outwitted cruel lords, children who wandered into the forest and returned with enchanted gifts. These were the tales you told when the cold had gone on too long, and everyone needed a reason to laugh, or at least to remember that life wasn't only about scraping together enough fuel to last the week. One favourite genre, miracle stories. They were like spiritual bedtime tales for grown-ups. A starving family prays, and their last candle stays lit all night. A traveller collapses in the snow and wakes up inside a chapel they swear wasn't there before. A loaf of bread multiplies in a basket, feeding a dozen people when there should have been only crumbs. You didn't have to believe them, but it didn't hurt. They gave you permission to hope. And then there were the local legends, stories rooted in your particular corner of the world. Maybe your village had a haunted grove, a frozen pond no one would skate on, a crumbling stone where, centuries ago, a witch turned a miser to ice for refusing to share his soup. These weren't just stories, they were landmarks, as important as the well or the road to market. In winter, when you couldn't see any of those landmarks through the snow, the stories reminded you they were still there, that you were still there. Some households kept story tokens, wooden carvings, stones, bits of bone or cloth tied to particular tales, a ring worn smooth from being passed hand to hand during the telling of a love story. A carved goat used to act out a funny tale about a trickster animal that stole a bishop's cheese. These objects didn't have value outside the home, but inside they were treasure, especially in a world where most people had nothing more permanent than the next good fire. Storytelling was also a kind of memory insurance. When someone old began to falter, when they couldn't do the physical work anymore, they became the keeper of tales. It gave them purpose. You'd sit with your back against the hearth, legs tucked under a blanket, listening as your grandfather talked about the winter. The river froze so hard you could walk across with a cart. He described the blizzard that buried the chapel doors, or the time wolves came into town and were driven off by a candle procession. And yes, stories were full of exaggeration. That storm wasn't quite as deadly. That wolf wasn't quite as big. But exaggeration was part of the warmth. The bigger the story, the smaller the cold felt. One fascinating fringe tradition, dream recitations. In parts of medieval Scandinavia, it was believed that dreams during a blizzard carried prophetic weight. People would gather the morning after a storm and recount what they'd seen in their sleep. Some claimed to visit long-dead relatives, others dreamed of spring coming early, or of houses made of sun-warmed stone. These dreams were shared like folk tales, interpreted like scripture, and if someone dreamt of a green field or a blooming tree, people clung to it, repeated it, told it again that night. Hope passed mouth to mouth. Scholars debate how seriously these stories were taken. Some think they were just a way to pass time, primitive entertainment for people with nothing else. But others argue that stories in winter weren't just optional, they were essential. That in a world ruled by nature's indifference, where fire was uncertain and food never guaranteed, the ability to imagine a different outcome, to picture yourself surviving, escaping, triumphing, was as vital as knowing how to split logs or seal a window. And maybe that's why, even now, we still huddle up on dark nights and tell each other tales. We binge shows, we spin podcasts, we whisper ghost stories by flashlight, because we've never stopped needing the warmth of narrative. It fills the same ancient space. So the next time you're stuck in a storm, whether it's outside your window or inside your head, try this. Light a candle, wrap up tight, and tell a story. Any story. A memory. A lie. A legend. Doesn't matter. Tell it out loud. Let it fill the room. Because in the coldest part of the year, sometimes the thing that keeps you alive isn't heat. It's a voice in the dark saying, "Once upon a time..." You've tried everything to stay warm. The fire's crackling, the stew's simmering. You've even plugged up the drafty window with that old sack of moss and moth-eaten wool. But what if you can't stop? What if you're not tucked away in a cosy cottage, but out there in the snow because your job, your very life, requires it? You're not a peasant with a hearth or a monk with a stone cloister. You're part of the military. Or maybe you're a herder, a trader, a nomad. And in winter, you're on the move. You don't get to hibernate like the rest of the village. You sleep in a tent if you're lucky, under a cart if you're not. And when the blizzards hit, you don't pull the shutters. There are no shutters. Instead, you become the shelter. It's hard to overstate how brutal this was. Medieval campaigns didn't pause for snowstorms. Kings still wanted their taxes collected. Armies still marched. Raiders still raided. If anything, winter was a tactical season. Snow muffled footsteps. Ice froze rivers into highways. Starving villages made easier targets. So soldiers, mercenaries and scouts had to learn the hard art of surviving while in motion, often in open terrain, carrying everything they needed on their backs, or strapped to a donkey that was regretting every hoofstep of its career. So how did they do it? Let's start with the basics. Portable shelter. Tents, but not the kind you're thinking of. Medieval military tents were heavy, canvas or wool stretched over wooden poles and pegged into frozen earth with stakes that bent or snapped when the ground got too hard. If the snow was deep enough, you didn't bother with pegs. You dug out a hollow and piled snow around the edges to hold it down. Smart soldiers carried extra cloth to wrap around the bottom and block drafts. Even smarter ones dug shallow trenches under the floor to allow melted snow and urine to drain. Yes, that's a real thing. The cold was so intense during some campaigns that soldiers would sleep in shifts, rotating positions around the fire like rotisserie chickens. One group would sleep close to the flames while the others huddled near the edge, half frozen but patient. Then they'd switch. Sometimes they slept upright, shoulder to shoulder, under shared cloaks, and if it got really bad, they'd pile dirt or snow on top of their cloaks to trap body heat. It sounds counterintuitive, but the extra weight of snow acted like insulation, at least until someone had to dig themselves out to pee. There's a particularly miserable account from the English invasion of Scotland in 1298, when Edward I's army was forced to camp in winter conditions without proper supplies. Many of the men wore their armour to bed, not for protection from swords, but from the cold. It kept their core temperatures up, though the trade-off was waking up stiff, bruised, and smelling like a blacksmith's floor. And let's not forget the nomadic communities, who made moving through snow look almost graceful. Mongol horsemen, for example, were known for riding through snowstorms with minimal gear, using felt-lined saddles and furs layered so efficiently it made European armour look like decorative tinsel. They built quick, low-profile tents, called gers or yurts, depending on region, that could be insulated with layers of felt and animal hide. When needed, they'd dig shallow snow pits, line them with hides, and sleep coiled around one another, their horses standing nearby, steam rising off their flanks. In parts of Eastern Europe, Romani travellers moved in caravans even during the cold months. Their wagons weren't insulated, but they were close-knit communities with a long oral tradition of cold weather survival. Children were trained early in how to gather kindling under snow, how to walk without breaking through thin ice, how to sleep beneath 2 wet blankets and still get up in the morning without crying. Much. Back on the military front, the idea of heating the camp wasn't just a luxury. It was a form of defence. Fires had to be managed carefully. Too many, and you ran out of fuel. Too few, and you lost men overnight. Some armies carried portable braziers, metal bowls on legs used to hold hot coals. You'd heat stones in them, then wrap the stones in cloth and place them under blankets. The stones radiated heat for hours, and if you were really lucky, no one burned their cloak in the process. Another trick? Sleeping inside your saddle. Not just using it as a pillow, literally curling into it, using the curved leather and thick padding as a windbreak. Horses were tethered around the edge of the camp not just for protection, but as a living wall. Their bodies blocked wind, their breath warmed the air. In extreme cases, soldiers slept under their horses' bellies, dangerous, smelly, and weirdly effective. And what did they eat? Don't ask. Frozen meat, if any. Dried beans. Hard biscuits you had to soften with spit before chewing. In some desperate cases, they ate their horses, or leather, or bark. One chronicler in a 14th century French campaign described a soldier boiling his shoe and seasoning it with a prayer and the last of the mustard. Grim, yes, but also darkly practical. And for those who were not soldiers but still always moving, like shepherds, messengers, or even exiled monks, the pack was everything. You carried your cloak, your knife, your flint, maybe a scrap of waxed cloth to cover your head in the snow. You learned to find shelter in tree roots, under rock overhangs, or in half-collapsed ruins. If you were smart, you carried salt. If you were lucky, a flask of strong alcohol. There's a strange open debate among historians about just how many of these techniques were common knowledge and how many were rare exceptions. We know about the big campaigns and the famous survival stories, but for the average traveller, those forced to move through snow because they had no choice, the record is murky. Maybe they knew how to dig a snow pit. Maybe they just walked until they found someone's firelight. What's certain is that survival on the move meant accepting constant discomfort. You were never truly dry, never truly warm. Your feet were always half numb, your cloak always stiff with frost by morning. And yet, people did it. Every winter, every generation. Because the world didn't stop moving and neither could they. So next time you complain about your morning commute in a light snow, just imagine strapping a half-frozen roast to your donkey, curling up next to its steaming backside, and praying your boots don't shatter when you stand up. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't romantic, but it worked. And when the storm passed, when the path was clear again, they didn't build statues to those who survived in motion. But maybe they should have. Eventually the cold wins, and you can fight it with fire, with fur, with clever little tricks like straw in the cracks and soup on the coals. But in the end, there's always someone whose body just can't keep up. Someone who sleeps too close to the wall, someone who falls on the ice and doesn't get back up, someone who has to go out and fetch water when it's 15 below and never makes it home. Because even the best shelter sometimes fails, and when it does, the consequences are sharp, quiet, and final. Frostbite, for instance, didn't have a name back then, not a medical one, but everyone knew it. They called it the black finger, the dead toe, or just winter's bite. You'd see it start in the extremities, the fingertips, the nose, the ears, turning white, then blue, then horrifyingly black. Sometimes the flesh peeled, sometimes it went numb, and sometimes it simply fell off. In monasteries, where people at least kept records, there are grim mentions of monks losing toes after long walks to fetch firewood or deliver food to the poor. In villages, it happened quietly. A child went to play in the snow, and by evening their fingertips were stiff and blistered. A farmer dug out the barn, slipped, and by morning his foot was blue and ballooned. And you had almost nothing to treat it with. No antibiotics, no skin grafts. The best you could do was warm the limb slowly, not too fast, or rub it with snow, a technique passed down more out of ritual than science. Some swore by goose fat, others packed the damaged area in dung and straw, not to heal it, but to keep the smell from drawing flies when the flesh began to rot. Charming. Even if frostbite didn't get you, hypothermia might. Again, they didn't have a word for it, but they knew the signs. Slurred speech, stumbling, sudden, irrational behaviour. There's an eerie consistency in the old stories. People who, in the final stages, began to strip off their clothes, who insisted they were too hot, who wandered outside barefoot, who lay down in the snow because it felt somehow like the softest bed in the world. This was sometimes called snow sleep, and it had a kind of mythical weight to it. Villagers told stories of those who walked into the storm and lay down, never to be seen again, only to reappear in spring when the thaw revealed their bodies, perfectly preserved, eyes closed as if in prayer. There was fear, yes, but also a strange peace in these stories, as if dying in the snow wasn't the worst way to go. But death wasn't the only danger when shelter failed. Illness thrived in the cold. Coughs turned into consumption. Chills turned into fevers. And if one person in the house got sick, chances were everyone did. You were packed in too close, breathing the same smoky air, sharing the same water, the same stale blankets. No fresh air, no sunshine, just rot and rattle, and the sound of someone trying not to wake the baby, while they hacked up blood into a cloth they'd eventually toss into the fire. Then there were the accidents. Roofs collapsed under the weight of snow, chimneys cracked, fires sparked from overloaded hearths. In one recorded case in 14th century Bohemia, an entire cottage burned down during a snowstorm, not because of enemy attack, not because of divine judgment, but because someone tossed damp wood onto the fire, left the hearth unattended, and the sparks caught the thatch. The neighbours found the family half buried in ash and snow the next morning. They rebuilt the house in spring, said it was fate. Sometimes the most devastating failure was psychological. Shelter doesn't just protect your body, it protects your mind. When it breaks down, when the wind gets in, when the roof leaks, when the fire keeps dying and nobody can sleep, you start to unravel. Arguments flare, parents snap at their children, siblings go silent, hunger sharpens every word. In extreme cases, people stopped speaking altogether, just sat, rocking, staring into the embers, waiting. And then there's the truly grim stuff. The stuff nobody wanted to write down. In the worst winters, during famines, sieges, long months of snow when help couldn't reach you, there are rumours, whispers, a stew that tasted off, a baby that stopped crying and vanished overnight, a sudden abundance of meat when the goats were all gone. These stories live on not in the records but in the space between them, in the gaps where the chroniclers went silent. You can't say for sure that people turned to cannibalism, but when you read how quickly the burial fields filled, how many children died in their sleep, how often homes were described as quiet for weeks, you start to wonder. One fringe belief from the Carpathians tells of a spirit called the Zimna Baba, the cold hag. She comes not during the storm itself, but in the weeks after, when food is low and tempers are high. She slips in through the cracks in the wall, the ones you forgot to stuff with moss. She sits in the corner, invisible, making the fire burn low and the soup run thin. She feeds on your despair, and if you're not careful, she convinces someone to go outside and look for wood, knowing they'll never come back. Just a story, of course. But on the 4th week of snow, when your breath fogs in the air inside your house, you believe. Historians argue about how frequent these failures really were. Some say we romanticize the suffering, assume everyone was constantly freezing and dropping dead just because the records are dramatic. Others believe the silence in the documents hides the true scale of the horror, that when shelter failed, it failed completely, and no one wanted to remember what happened next. What's not in dispute is this. The people who lived through these winters came out different. Scarred, physically and mentally. Some never left their homes again in winter, terrified of the sky turning white. Some never spoke about the year the roof fell or the baby died or the food ran out, and yet they rebuilt. Always. Thatched the roof again, repacked the moss, dug out the hearth, set the fire, and waited for the next storm. Because when shelter fails, you don't just lose warmth, you lose trust. In the walls, in the world, in each other. But medieval people, stubborn and half-frozen though they were, always tried again. Because that's what you do. You patch the hole, you light the fire, and you survive. And somehow, despite everything, the blizzards, the cold, the frostbitten fingers, the bad stew, the haunted snow-covered barns, you're still here. The wind has finally eased. The snow on the roof isn't groaning like it wants to kill you in your sleep anymore. Outside there's a slow melt happening, drop by icy drop, and the sun, though still pale and weak, is starting to hang around a little longer each day. You've made it through the storm, which means now you can stop, look around at the ragged house, the ash-covered hearth, the straw-stuffed door frame, and ask the inevitable question, what survived? And maybe the better one, what didn't? Because when the snow finally thaws and spring begins to claw its way back across the land, you don't just resume life as it was. You pick through the remains, you find what worked, what failed, and what, against all odds, actually helped keep you alive. And from those pieces you build the next version of your life. That's the true legacy of medieval winter shelter, resilience made visible. Some of it stays with you for generations, like thatch for instance, messy, flammable, deceptively strong. Thatched roofs remain the default for centuries in many parts of Europe, precisely because they handled winter weight better than people gave them credit for. The way snow settled on them, like a thick woolen blanket, actually added insulation. That design wasn't a fluke. It was the result of trial, error, collapse, and careful rebuilding, or semi-subterranean homes. These weren't fancy, half-dug pits, low roofs, dirt floors, but they endured in cold climates because they made thermodynamic sense. Heat rises, after all, and if your ceiling's only 5 feet above the floor and made of turf, you trap it better. Inuit and Slavic groups weren't the only ones doing this. Even in Scotland and Scandinavia, you find signs of sunken floors and turf-covered walls, what we might call primitive, but which were in reality deeply clever adaptations. And then there's the longhouse, a marvel of multi-purpose living. These structures, where humans and animals shared a roof through the dead of winter, were not just about space. They were about shared heat, shared survival, and a refusal to freeze alone. The smell? Unbearable. The payoff? Life-saving. You might gag when you stepped in the door, but your toes still worked in the morning. That's a win. Even the communal strategies, villagers digging snow tunnels between homes, building shared fire pits, huddling 10 to a bed, left their marks. As settlements grew, some of these patterns hardened into social norms. The idea of helping your neighbour through winter didn't just come from kindness, it came from watching someone not survive and realising that next year, that could be you. There are design cues we still use today without realising their medieval roots. Low ceilings in cottages. That's not just about coziness, it's about heat retention. Heavy curtains over doorways. Insulation before we had the word. Moss between logs. Double shutters. Inner rooms built within outer rooms. All early forms of thermal zoning. Your great-great-great-grandson figured that out by freezing half to death and then swearing they'd never do that again. One curious legacy. In some villages, homes were rebuilt slightly smaller after a brutal winter. The idea was simple. Less space equals less area to heat. We like to think of the past as always aiming for bigger, grander, more imposing. But in cold country, the smart ones scaled down. A tighter space was a warmer space. A warmer space was a safer one. The medieval McMansion was not a thing. Tiny homes. Medieval people invented that out of necessity. Then, of course, there's what didn't make it. The homes with large open windows and vaulted ceilings, beautiful in spring, deadly in January, places with no chimney, just a smoke hole. Cosy until the wind shifted and blew snow down into the fire. Settlements built in valleys, where cold air settled like water in a basin. Gone, abandoned, or moved to the hills within a generation. And the materials, some of them just didn't last. Clay alone cracked under frost, bark peeled, thin thatch collapsed. Entire building styles vanished because they couldn't handle the weight of a proper blizzard. What remains archaeologically is what worked. Stone with wood, turf with wattle and daub, logs with moss. And even those needed constant patching, fixing, tweaking. Nothing was perfect. Everything was maintained, or it failed. And yes, failure happened. You knew that going in. Winter took someone every year. Sometimes an old man who didn't wake up. Sometimes a child too small for the cold. Sometimes an entire family, their home caved in, discovered days later by neighbours. That was part of the rhythm. Grief, even in its sharpest edge, was folded into the season like another log on the fire. Burning, yes, but giving warmth to those left behind. But here's the thing. Survival left marks too. Not just on architecture, but on people. The way they planned, the way they told stories, the way they built homes not just for comfort but for defence, against weather, against time. They remembered the storms that took their relatives. They remembered the winter the firewood ran out. They taught their children to check the roof, to hang blankets over the door, to listen for the wind and smell the snow before it arrived. And those lessons, those small, ordinary, freezing cold miracles of wisdom, somehow made it all the way to us. Maybe not in the same language, maybe not in the same materials, but in instinct. That desire to check the windowsill in December, to pull out an extra blanket even when the heat's still on, to stock up on canned soup when the forecast looks dicey. Somewhere deep in your bones, a little medieval ancestor is whispering, "Be ready." We've seen this before, so the legacy isn't just in thatched roofs or packed earth walls, it's in how we think about shelter, about preparation, about what it means to build something, not just to live in, but to survive in. The warmth, the light, the layers of insulation you don't even see. Someone earned that knowledge with frostbitten fingers and too many nights spent huddled next to a dying fire. And every time we light a candle, turn up the heat, or seal the draft under a door, we're still practicing a kind of ancient ritual, still fighting back the cold with everything we've got. Not just for comfort, but because deep down we remember what it's like when the shelter fails, and we've sworn it never will again. So here you are, still with me. The storm has passed, the fire's gone low, and your feet, tucked under that warm blanket, are just now starting to lose their chill. We've travelled together through howling winds, dripping rooftops, and the quiet desperation of families packed into huts with smoke in their lungs and straw in the cracks. We've seen frostbite, miracle stews, ghost stories, and dung-packed walls, and yet, somehow, none of it feels all that far away, does it? Because even with central heating and double-glazed windows, there's something that lingers. Something timeless in the way people brace themselves for the cold. That primal instinct to gather close, to shut out the wind, to tell stories and share warmth in whatever way we can. We might live in a different world, but winter hasn't changed its mind about us. It still creeps in where it's unwelcome, still tests us. But you're tucked in. You made it, just like they did. So take a moment now. Breathe deep. Let the echoes of the snow-covered past fade into the silence of your room. Maybe you hear the hum of a fan, the soft buzz of a heater, or just the stillness that comes when the world finally settles down. That's your shelter now, simple, quiet, built on centuries of human grit and ingenuity. Thanks for sticking around through the storm, through the centuries, and through the soot-smudged windows of history. Wherever you are, whatever the weather outside, you're part of a long unbroken chain of people who looked winter in the face and said, "Not this time." Sleep warm, sleep safe.